Lower the lights, friend. Let the fan hum. Let the room shrink to the size of your breath. Tonight you're standing in a marble hallway that still remembers triumphs it can no longer host. Columns rise like pale trees. The frescoes are tired of pretending, and the lamplight trembles across faces that don't look back anymore. It is the year 476, and the Western Roman Empire is down to a last breath, drawn by a boy emperor named Romulus Augustulus. You do not hear a catastrophic scream. Empires rarely go out that way. Instead, you hear polite footsteps and the quiet exchange of formal words as Odoacer, a Germanic commander with the steadiness of a man who has seen too much winter, accepts the imperial regalia. A cloak, a diadem, a bundle of meaning handed from a teenager to a soldier who knows the difference between symbols and grain. If the past were only blood and banners, the moment would feel small. But you can feel the floor under you, and the floor is Rome's true miracle, not the marble the system beneath. Roads that connect taxes to treasuries, treasuries to paymasters, paymasters to legions, legions to engineers, engineers to aqueducts, aqueducts to clean water, clean water. Too fewer funerals to more minds free to think. The floor is a web. The web is knowledge. And tonight, a strand is being cut where it matters most, the part that rewove things when they frayed. The boy breathes in. A continent exhales. What is lost instantly? Not everything. Buildings do not collapse because a crown moves from one head to another. Farmers still know when to sow winter wheat. Smiths still know the orange glow that means the iron will listen. Paper does not ignite on its own, but the maintenance, the dull genius of continuation begins to wobble. The Roman genius was not invention alone. It was administration, lists, copies, timetables, postings, postings recalled, postings replaced. A water channel's mild curve recorded in a ledger, the duties of an inspector written down, the name of the inspector's apprentice written beside it so someone knows whom to call when the inspector dies. Knowledge in Rome did not live only in books. It lived in roles jobs with precise names and predictable hours. The empire gathered Greek theory, Egyptian hydraulics, Persian astronomy, Celtic metallurgy, local soils and windsand, then it filed them. Filing is not romantic work, but it is how you keep the roof from dripping. Tonight, as the imperial seal changes hands, what truly slips is the habit of filing. Not everywhere, not at once, but enough to make a future of leaks. You walk outside into a city that wears its victories like old medals pinned to a coat nobody dares to wash. The roads are still excellent because someone's grandfather inspected them every spring. The bathhouse is still warm because someone's mother paid the fuel vendor on time. The aqueduct still whispers overhead because a kid with ink-stained fingers compared last year's flow to this year's and flagged a minor crack before it became a major break. The empire's bureaucracy may sound like boredom, but boredom is civilization's favorite instrument. When boredom retires, surprises arrive. Odoacer does not hate Rome. He needs it. He needs the steady tables, the vineyards on hills that keep their soil because someone planted trees upstream. He keeps Roman administrators where he can, yet he cannot pay all the clerks with coin when coin is scarce. He cannot keep the courier system fully fed when harvests are uncertain. He cannot ask 10,000 small offices to run smoothly when the glue between them, tax, revenue collected on a schedule that depended on roads guaranteed by soldiers, guaranteed by money, has loosened. His power is strong at the top and thin along the edges. Knowledge, which used to move like a river, becomes a string of ponds. Walk with me to an archive, not the grand library with poets and marble busts, an office library, the kind where real memory lives. Shelves are stacked with the useful things: bridge load tables, land grants, water allotments, medical compilations that tell a provincial healer which herbs help burns and what not to try on a fever. You run your fingers along wooden tags that tell you exactly where to find the manual for inspectors responsible for segment 7 of the Aqua Claudia, because, yes, the Romans were that specific. Who keeps this room open when the budget is late, when the scribe has not been paid, when the wax tablets ran out last month and the new shipment is somewhere east of Ravenna, because the muleteer refuses to risk bandits? If knowledge is a cathedral, its mortar is mundane trust. If you can't pay the mason, the stones still exist, but the arch doesn't. The city does not empty, but it simplifies. A senator who once kept correspondence in 3 provinces now keeps an eye on 2 villages. A school that taught Greek rhetoric now tutors Latin contracts when there are contracts to sign at all. An engineer who once learned to calculate water pressure retires with no apprentice, because the young man who would have learned the numbers is learning to shoe horses instead. None of this is evil. Much of it is necessary. Necessary is how knowledge loosens its grip. A common picture calls the coming centuries dark. That isn't fair to the people who will farm, build, heal, pray, and love with astonishing skill. But if by dark we mean less connected, then yes, the dimness you feel is the distance growing between places that used to speak fluently to one another. The empire had been a conversation. Tonight it whispers out on the road still. Excellent, for now you meet carriers traveling with small bundles, not scrolls alone, but habits. How to scribe a clean hand, how to index a shelf, how to check a bridge by the sound it makes under cartwheels. These are not secrets, but they are techniques, and techniques survive best in guilds, schools, and agencies. When institutions thin, techniques cling to families or vanish into chance. You pass a bathhouse whose hypocaust still radiates yesterday's heat. The stoker keeps the fire going because he knows which vents choke in the rain. He learned that from his mother, who learned it from a cousin, who learned it from a soldier, who married into the family when the 9th passed through, long before anyone began counting winters by kings. This is knowledge alive in hands and ears. It survives well until a roof fails, until tile cracks, until no one has the right spare brick because the kill is 100 miles away and the road watchers at mile marker 32 are gone. At the city's edge, a woman boils water and loosens a child's cough with fennel and honey. She is wise. Much wisdom will endure because it lives at the scale of breath and kitchen and field. But some knowledge requires scale itself, an observatory. To verify a star chart, a glass works to make a lens, a written survey to show where a hillside will fail in heavy rain. Scale is expensive. Empires are one way to pay for it. Without a treasury large enough to underwrite long attention, attention narrows to urgent circles. A circle can be good, tight, beloved. It cannot, on its own, maintain aqueducts across mountains. Night arrives gently. The city glows in scattered lamps. The boy who surrendered the purple sleeps, maybe for the first time in months. Soldiers on the walls listen for hooves. A clerk folds his last letter and sighs without anger, only with the sober relief of someone who has done what could be done. Tomorrow he will still write, but fewer copies. Next month, he may trade ink for seed. He has children. You stand in the hallway again and hear something soft, not word silence, acquiring weight. It is the sound of a system shifting from paper to memory, from network to neighborhood. Not death, not even disaster. A long, slow shrinking of the space in which ideas travel at speed. Before we leave, press your palm to the stone. Feel the cool. The stone will stand a long time. People will live well here. But to rebuild the web that held so many minds together will require a new kind of patience. Different patrons, different schools, different scripts, different sounds. It will require centuries of stubborn caretakers who believe that a page is a bridge, a shelf is a harbor, and a lamp, trimmed and watched, can outlast a winter of any length. Keep the lights low. Let the fan whisper. Shift from marble to timber, from senate to cloister. The next chapter of memory survival begins not with trumpets, but with footsteps in sandals and the dry, steady music of a quill. We are in southern Italy, along the Calabrian curve of the boot, where an aging statesman named Cassiodorus has a strange, practical dream. If the state can no longer keep the ledgers of the world, perhaps a monastery can. He calls his place Viverima, living space for texts. Not a palace of pagan poets, not a court of polished rhetoric, but a workshop where the book itself is the tool. His plan is both humble and radical. Recruit men who have pledged their lives to prayer and give them a second vout to copy. Copying is not glamorous. It is also not simple. Step closer to the desk. The parchment lying there was once many sheep. A book is a flock transformed. A scribe has stretched, scraped, pumices, smoothed. Ink is brewed iron salts, oak galls, a patient boil to bite. Just enough into the skin. A line is ruled, letters grow. The scribe's back knots, the lamp smokes, a winter cough rattles down the benches, and still the hand moves. This is what a bridge looks like when an empire is gone, a person making another person's sentence live in a place it would never have reached alone. Cassiodorus is not alone in this thought. North of here, a former Roman soldier named Benedict has founded a community at Monte Cassino with rules that braidwork to prayer. Ora et labora, pray and labor. To outsiders, the labor looks like gardening or cooking, and yes, bodies must eat. But the monasteries quickly discover a second harvest. Manuscripts planted, tended, gathered, bound. Listen to the room. You'll hear two kinds of scratching. The first is the copying of sacred text, the Psalms and Gospels, and that would be reason enough to keep the lamps trimmed. But listen harder, and you'll hear the second sound, the slightly different rhythm of a scribe tracing a diagram of a water screw, or a page of herbal remedies, or a table of eclipses. The monastery will always put God first. Within that order, it shelters useful things that the world cannot currently afford to pay clerks to keep. You might imagine fistfights over philosophier saints against pagans, scripture against science, but the daily truth is more logistical. Parchment is expensive. Time is finite. A prior stands at the cupboard and counts blank pages and sighs like a quartermaster before a long march. We can copy this winter, he decides, finger on a list in a hand older than his. We cannot copy that yet. The economy of attention becomes policy, and policy, copied, becomes fate. What gets chosen? Often what serves scripture, grammar, and rhetoric survive because preachers need them. Logic survives because theology argues precisely. Some medicine survives because sick monks need help. Some farming notes survive because cloister gardens feed villagers in bad years. A great many things do not survive because no one nearby needs them right now, and the skins run out and winter arrives early. But notice something hopeful. The monastery is a network node. Pilgrims pass through, travelers rest. A young man from Gaul with a knack for letters stays for a season and copies a text the house did not own yesterday. An Irish monk leaves a book behind like a seed in a pocket. A traveler from the east brings a manuscript that smells faintly of cinnamon and sea. Each quiet gatehouse is a customs post of ideas, stamped not with tariffs but with blessings and bread. Step into the scriptorium. Monastic architects learn to catch daylight in clever ways. High windows to wash the desks. Angled benches, a guttered lamp for dark afternoons. Some houses invent Colophonsteiny notes at a copy's end where a weary scribe might write. Whoever reads this, pray for me, turning a finished page into a thread between the living and the future. Some invent correction marks, a language of dots and curls that let a later eye fix an earlier hand without damaging the chain. It is slow, it is small, and it is magnificent. Do the monks understand that they are saving the world? Many do not think in such terms. They are saving souls. They are obeying ours matins, lords, primand in the spaces between bells. They are keeping ink moving. Yet from these between bells come bridges, strong enough to carry libraries across centuries. You ask, were monks suspicious of pagan texts? Sometimes, and sometimes they loved them. A good librarian is a fox and a lamb, cautious about wolves, tender toward lambs, and strategic about what the henhouse can realistically protect. A prior may lock a manuscript, not to hide it from mines, but to hide it from mice. A shelf chain is not always a shackle. Often it is a seatbelt. Then there is language. Classical Latin, precise and muscular, begins to bend into local forms. Monks write what they speak. This can make a 5th century sentence squint in the 12th. To help monasteries build glosses, marginal notes explaining hard words, and compile lists of equivalents. When a community cannot read Greek and the only copy of a useful book is Greek, they find a neighbor who knows a neighbor who can translate a page at a time across a long winter. Books learn to walk in many shoes. The monastery is not a museum. It is enlivened. Life means risk. Vikings will come. Fire will visit. A plague will rattle the dormitory, and a perfect hand will never hold a pen again. But monastic life is made to absorb shocks. A brother falls. A brother steps into his place. A page smudges. A page is scraped and written again. The discipline that bows heads also keeps projects moving in bad weather. At a corner table, a young scribe named Marcus is copying a book that would not have been copied here a generation ago. It is Boethius, a Roman philosopher who tried to reconcile reason and faith and wrote in prison while politics sharpened knives outside his door. Marcus's lips move as he copies a passage on Fortune's wheel. He has never seen a palace. He knows the turn of the seasons by the way the cloister's grapevine leans. Yet locking his letters to Boethius's letters, he builds a bridge where neither of them will ever walk. This is how a past that lost its infrastructure begins to build one again, the back of a chair. Between a lamp and a window, one careful letter after another. You may ask, why here? Why monasteries? Because they have time. In a violent economy, time is wealth, because they live together by rule. Habits persist even when harvests don't, because they believe copying truth is a form of worship, which keeps morale high in jobs that would exhaust any army clerk. And because their doors, though guarded, are not barred, visitors carry news. And news brings texts, and texts bring skills, and skills bring more bread for the neighbors, which buys goodwill when the river floods. Do monasteries distort what they save? Sometimes, yes. A selection is a bias, and the shelf is a vote. But the alternative to a biased library is no library, and between those choices, lights choose lamps. Across generations, monks will preserve what the next era will need, to argue with them, surpass them, and thank them. A paradox wrapped in gratitude. Before we leave, step into the library proper. Notice the order. Books lying flat to protect their spines. Numbers on spines in red. A catalogue, perhaps primitive, perhaps surprisingly modern. Noting shelf C. Position 7. On farm tools and their proper use. A title that will keep a village fed one hard spring. You run your hand along leather that holds a poem copied for its grammar and kept for its courage. The room breathes a soft animal smelt parchment, wood, wool robes, a page turned dot outside. Wind leans against stone. Inside, a candle gutters and is trimmed. Hours pass. Bells call. The work pauses and resumes. Somewhere in the same network of houses, a sister house in Gaul teaches children to chant their letters. Somewhere in Ireland, a monk decorates a capital letter with a vine that will outlast the tower it's drawn beneath. Somewhere in a valley in Spain, a traveler sleeps with a book under his pillow because the sack he carries is worth more than the coins in his belt. And if the road is kind, he will end at a house like this and trade that book for another. These are the seeds in the ashes, small, concentrated, astonishingly alive. Plant enough of them and you don't get the Roman Empire back. You get something stranger and in its time, strong in different ways. A garden of script and prayer that keeps memory watered until cities, schools, and presses wake again. For now, breathe. The room is warm. The page is almost full. When the scribe dips his pen, the century does not change, but the future gets one more line to read. Keep the lights soft. Let the fan purr. Tonight we're not walking a road, we're listening to it. Not wagon wheels, not marching feet, but the small sounds people make when they try to understand each other and fail by inches. Picture a market in 7th century Gaul. A mule brays, fish scales flash in a wooden bowl. Someone hammers a bent clasped flat. Two merchants haggle over a bolt of dyed wool. One speaks a Latin that has grown warm and round in the mouth, rustic Latin bending toward what will one day be French. The other answers in a Latin salted with the rhythm of northern Italy, Proto-Italian, patiently approaching it. They keep repeating numbers, tapping the wall, sketching 3 and V in dust with a stick. They're both speaking Latin, but what leaves one mouth doesn't land cleanly in the other ear. They get there in the end. They always do. But it takes gestures and guesses and time. That is how a language breaks not with a snap, but with a drift. For centuries, Latin was the empire's road surface for thought. You could roll law on it, medicine, poetry, taxes, military orders, recipes for mortar. It traveled far because it had schools to keep it straight, clerks to keep it neat, copyists to keep it alive. When those systems thinned, Latin didn't die. It did what living things always do under pressure. Adapt. Start with the classroom. There are fewer of them now. A boy who might have learned to decline Rosa. Rosé is needed in the field. A girl who might have passed a sentence is needed at the loom. Grammar goes from a shared habit to a boutique skill. Without regular drilling, Case endings erode like soft stone in rain. People start relying on word order more than word endings. Prepositions pull extra weight. The elegant Latin sentence, once a box of fittings that could be assembled in many shapes, narrows toward a line that must be laid just so to stay clear. Then there's pronunciation. In a busy empire, teachers correct you. In a scattered countryside, your neighbor does. V starts to lean toward B in some valleys. C before E or I softens in others. One town says vita cleanly. Another says vita. Another lets the word wear down to vi. None of these are wrong to the people feeding their kids with them. They are local, and locality is lovely until you need to fix an aqueduct with someone 2 provinces away, who reads calyx and thinks cup, while you read calyx and hear pipe. Vocabulary likes to slip too. Classical Latin had 2 words for horse, equus in poetry, and law cabalus in barnyards. In the practical world where most people live, cabalus wins. Over time, cabalus shades into cheval, cavallo, cavallo, cavallo hoofbeats, turning into French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese. Useful words survive. Careful words scatter. That scattering is harmless when you're talking about lunch. It's costly when you're talking about land. Imagine a boundary charter copied by a local scribe who writes as he speaks. The original, century-old Latin describes the line as running to the old ash by the fossa ditch, then along the Agger bank. The new copy, trying to be helpful, replaces fossa with the local word everyone uses for cut, and Agger with a term that, in this valley, means ridge, though the ridge and the bank are different things here. 50 years later, the grandsons go to court because a millstream sat on one meaning and a pasture sat on another. The judge reads 2 copies of Latin and hears 2 landscapes. In monasteries, the paper batteries we visited last time, the scribes do their best. They copy in a Latin that has become monastic Latin, a sturdy, serviceable tool. If a sentence bumps, a scribe writes a gloss in the margin, a small, local explanation for a large, old word. Multiply this across Europe for generations, and you get living manuscripts thick with quiet conversations. A Roman author in the middle, little regional hands around him, whispering what he really means. The glosses are kindness. They're also evidence. Language is not universal in the way it used to be. Why does this matter, you ask? People can still talk, they can. But some kinds of knowledge are fragile in vocabulary. Medicine needs precise names for body parts and herbs. Law needs sharp edges on terms like usufruct and immunity. Mathematics needs a way to say what equals what without grey fog sneaking in. When Latin phrase, precision suffers. Imagine a compound in a Roman remedy becoming a regional nickname somewhere along the chain. The recipe works in one valley because they've kept the plant straight, and fails in another because they've replaced it with a cousin leaf that looks right and behaves wrong. Add Greek to the problem. Rome once had plenty of bilinguals. As institutions thin, Greek drains out of the West, except in a few learned pockets. So not only is Latin drifting, the shelf of books that were never Latin to begin with Aristotle, Galen, Euclid tilts away. A monk can copy a Latin medical compilation that summarized Galen. He cannot correct it against the Greek if the summary wandered years ago. The ladder loses rungs, yet the story is not just loss. Drift makes new things, while one road to knowledge, fog's local paths grow lush. Farmers name winds in their own tongues with a precision Latin never bothered with. Smiths invent terms for a color of iron just before it slumps a shade only their dialect can capture. Fishermen anchor words to tides and estuaries that ancient handbooks never saw. The emerging vernaculars that people's tongues carry finely grained, place-drew wisdom. They just don't yet carry geometry the way a cross-continental school system would need. You can hear the split in a single day in a monastery. Morning, the Pater Noster in Latin, memorized by layers of boys and elders. Afternoon, a priest awkwardly shifting into the local speech to give a sermon everyone can follow. He reaches for words that do not exist yet, or exist only as workarounds. He chooses clarity over beauty and is proud of that, as he should be. Outside the chapel, two lay brothers discuss repairs to a wall entirely in their village tongue. Inside the library, a scholar murmurs through a page of Augustine in Latin that would have felt clean to a listener 200 years earlier. One building, 3 languages, none of them quite the same. Efforts to repair the split begin early. In Spain, Isidore of Seville compiles a vast encyclopedia trying to hold the meanings in one basket: definitions, synonyms, histories of words so future readers won't lose their grip. In the north, Irish schools keep hard grammar alive, like a bright coal moved from hearth to hearth across wet fields. Later, a Frankish king named Charlemagne will decide that letters are as important as lances and ask scholars, including Alcuin of York, to standardize spelling, correct texts, and teach priests to read what they preach. Scriptoriums under his umbrella adopt a clean, rounded-hand Carolingian minuscule, the first big visual truce in a long time. You can read it at arm's length. Even if your Latin isn't perfect, the letters behave. But even with reforms, the vernaculars keep blooming because they serve daily life. In courts, where a case might hinge on whether a phrase meant a lifetime or for this life, judges start asking witnesses to repeat themselves in the rustic Roman tongue, early romancer in Germanic speech, so the crowd understands who owes whom. The law may be written in Latin. The verdict must live in a village. The world learns to code switch. Mathematics feels the strain in ways that are both obvious and invisible. Latin keeps Roman numerals, which are perfectly good for counting sacks and soldiers, but heavy for calculation. The counting board and the finger reconning traditions help. But there is a ceiling to what you can comfortably compute and teach without shared, sleek notation and crisp terms. A monastery student can still learn how to find the date of Easter, how to track the moon, how to measure a field, but to push further, to generalize, compare, publish, patterns across regions, you need both words and symbols to travel. The hard part isn't only that Latin drifts, it's that drifting happens unevenly. In one valley, light shades toward light. In another, Luz. In a third, Lumiere comes a century later. So a medical note copied in one house can be legible to its neighbors and nearly opaque 100 miles away. This creates pockets of brilliance that do not fertilize one another. A beautiful commentary sits in a chest, admired locally, unknown elsewhere because the title on the spine might as well be a private joke. If you want a sound that captures the age, listen not only for chanting and quills, listen for whispered translations. A monk bends over a page and writes tiny letters above a hard word, little bridges called interlinear glosses. This means he's not showing off. He's writing to someone in the future who will not share his mouth's habits. He hopes to be helpful to a reader who hasn't been born yet, somewhere. A young woman in a manor house tallies rent in a Latin that would make Cicero wince and her tenants nod. She's more literate than her brother, who can saddle a war in the dark but can't read its sale contract by day. Her book of accounts mixes Latin stems with local endings and practical numerals and a little private shorthand for flour. Barley, wool. It is chaotic. It is clear to the people who need it. It is the present in ink. Languages aren't calmed by scolding. They're calmed by infrastructure schoolmasters, letters that match sounds, dictionaries that don't wobble, a community that thinks it's worth staying consistent. The West is rebuilding those things slowly in cloisters and courts. The East, in the meantime, speaks Greek as if Athens were just over the hill and will later speak Arabic with precision and invention that will astonish the West when those books come sailing back. But that's for another night. Tonight, sit with a single page. The main text is Latin from a long-dead hand. The margins are a conversation. On one side, a note in a tidy, rounded script. Id est, water that rises here and not from the city pipe. On the other, a quick scratch. Same plant as we call worm leaf by the river. At the bottom, a scribe has written, almost shyly, "Pray for me, the sinner who copied this." That line is Latin, yes. It's also universal, but walk back through the market as the sun drops. The two merchants have agreed, finally, on a price. They seal it with hands, and with a few words both understand, even if they would spell those words differently. A child tugs a mother's sleeve and asks the name of the color on the wall. The mother answers in a word that does not exist in any old Roman poem and will someday appear in a printed book with an accent mark. A world is holding itself together with sound. Language did not shatter and vanish. It multiplied. The cost was clarity across distance. The gift was intimacy with place. Somewhere, a teacher is lighting a lamp and opening a primer to try one more time to keep the old rope from fraying further. Somewhere else, a grandmother is teaching a proverb in a tongue no book yet acknowledges in keeping her village. Wise, breathe. The fan is steady. The page is full. Tomorrow we'll cross a sea of ink to a city where, while Europe's sentences drifted apart, a library was stitching them together, again book to book, mind to mind, till the light grew bright enough to be seen from very far away. Dim the lamp. Let the fan carry a slow desert breeze across your room. Tonight we cross from Europe's scattered whispers to a city that speaks in whole sentences, clear, quick, confident. The year is somewhere in the 9th century. The Tigris moves like ink under a crescent moon, and Baghdad, the round city, glows with windows that do not close early. Here sleep is optional when a page is interesting. You enter a long, cool hall where the air smells of gum, Arabic, leather, and the faint pepper of fresh-cut reed pens. Scribes bend over desks pinned with paper, not parchment sheets, thin as breath and smooth under the knife. Somewhere to the east, artisans learned the secret of making it from pulped fiber and flowing water. The craft traveled along the bones of Asia until mill wheels turned in Samarkand and then in Baghdad, and words became affordable. What Europe could copy in tens, Baghdad could copy in hundreds. This is Beit al-Hikmo, the House of Wisdom, part library, part translation studio, part workshop, part debate club, part dream. Shelves stand like orchards. Books hang in leather jackets. Others lie flat in chests. The city's ruler wants knowledge the way a thirsty person wants water. And patron scalifs, viziers, merchants fat with caravan profit, pay scholars to gather, translate, compare, argue, improve. Listen to the room. you will not hear one. Language, you'll hear Greek phrase softly into Syriac, then lifted into Arabic with a new shine. You'll hear Sanskrit carried across a table by a traveler who knows stars as if they were relatives, then written down in script that curves, like palm leaves in wind. You'll hear Hebrew in a rabbi's careful voice, Persian folded into history, and the steady consonants of men from distant monasteries who do their best work when the room gets quiet. The house of wisdom is a crossroads that doesn't tax the traveler, it pays him. At one desk sits a physician translator whose eyes are tireless, someone in the family of Cunayn ibn Isq, the kind of scholar who takes a Greek medical book that had been gnawed at by centuries of copying and returns it cleaner than the original. He does not just swap words. He writes letters to colleagues in other cities, hunts for second copies, collates, checks terms for the parts of the eye, the pulse, the fever. If a passage makes no sense, he refuses to let it pass. He is not worshipping the ancients. He is interrogating them with respect and a scalpel at another table. A quiet man draws lines and writes equations like a composer marking a score. You would recognize his name even in your sleep moo. Ahmad of Nemes. Al-How. He is writing a book with a straightforward project. Solve problems in a way ordinary people can teach and repeat. He calls it a compendium. By completion and balancing Al-Jabor or El-Mukbala, and the word Al-Jabor will trail him into your language as algebra. From his name you will get algebrith, a reminder that this room is not just copying, it is systematizing the old. Roman numerals pale beside the clean place value virtue of the numerals he works with. A dot for zero is not a hole but a hinge that lets calculations swing open. Turn your head and you'll catch the gleam of brass. A trio of brothers, the Ban Morsar, argued cheerfully over a device that pours water in one rhythm and then, by a hidden valve, in another. They collect mechanical tricks the way others collect poems. Automata that whistle when water rises. Lamps that self-trim. Fountains that surprise the unwary. Playful. Yes, but under the play is engineering, flow, pressure, timing. Control knowledge that will walk back west in time under many names. Climb the stairs to the roof. Instruments rest under cloth, astrolabes, sighting tubes, quadrants that bite. The sky at measured angles. You hear a student reciting a table from a new Zeji astronomical tables, meant to correct an older model by checking what the heavens actually do at night. The Abbasid Caliph who sponsors this place likes answers. More than nostalgia. He pays for an observatory because there is a practical question how to set calendars right, how to aim a Qibla wall accurately, and because, deeper than practical, there is wonder. A scholar lays a finger along a line of stars and says, softly, not quite where Ptolemy said, this is as important as any battle, the will to test a beautiful book against a beautiful night. Come back down and walk to the infirmaria, BBB Bristol, where the library smells like mint and vinegar, and beds line a courtyard watered by a thin fountain. Surgeons wash hands, teachers round with students who carry wax tablets and questions. The head physician has opinions about diet, fresh air, and when to cut and when to wait. He knows the names Hippocrates and Galen. He also knows the names of yesterday's patients and how they actually fared. In his storeroom, jars wear labels in a precise hand. If a remedy works, it is copied into a formulary and sent downriver to another hospital. If it fails, the margin says why. Here, preservation and experiment live under the same roof. You might expect suspicion between faiths in a room like this, but the house runs on competence and a double-cultured respect. A Christian translator sits beside a Muslim mathematician while a Jewish scholar checks a reading in the Greek. They argue, yes, but about meaning, not about who is allowed to hold the pen. The caliph's purse cares less what church you attend than whether your sentences hold and your numbers add. There are polemics in the world outside. Inside, the problem set is more urgent. Does the lens focus there or there? What happens to light when it enters water? How many ways can one unknown be balanced? Baghdad is not alone. Far west, Cordoba stocks shelves in palaces where orange trees scent the night. Further east, scholars in Ray, Nishapur, Bukhara keep their own lamps. The language that ties them is Arabic, precise, elastic, persuadable, carrying across deserts what Latin can no longer carry across mountains. A jurist in Cairene shade and a philosopher in Basran heat can read each other in the same alphabet and argue across months by letter. The map of learning looks like constellations, not one star, but many, tied by lines you can follow. On market day, step away from the palace into the Esque Ulricon, the bookseller's quarter. Stalls groan with stitched quires. You can buy a small grammar for your son, a poem for your daughter, an astronomical table if you're ambitious, a medical manual if you have steady hands and a strong stomach. Copyists advertise varied scripts. Some will illuminate your frontispiece with gold to please a patron. Others promise speed for students who have an exam and a nervous look. Men in dusty robes arrive off the road with a book wrapped in cloth. They will trade it for 3 others and a hot meal and go on to Basra. Books are not rare animals here. They are currency. The city has its frictions. A scholar sighs because his patron prefers astronomy to ethics this season. Another frets that a translation is too literal and loses the Greek cadence. A third complains that young students want answers without memorizing the old tools. Some officials would curb dangerous speculations. Some preachers thunder at philosophers who dare to measure what should be accepted. But the ship remains mostly on one heading: collect, clarify, compare. Correct, you notice details that belong to long attention. Shelves are labeled so that a stranger can find his way. Catalogues list what arrived last month and from where, like a ship ledger. The house keeps indices lists of subjects that make a library behave like a mind rather than a warehouse. If a manuscript burns, and they do, from clumsy elbows and lamps pushed to close, the loss is real but not catastrophic. A copy sits. A priver, another in a school across town, another in a merchant's trunk. This is not hoarding, it is distribution as a survival tactic. Remember our last night's worry about language breaking apart. Watch how Baghdad answers it. Translators prepare glossaries, fixing Arabic equivalents for Greek terms so that substance, accident, sphere, ratio, sign always mean what they ought. Lexicons pass from hand to hand. A young student can learn words the way an apprentice learns tools, by name, by balance, by feel. The chain that had broken in the West is relinked here, ring by careful ring. Not everything that thrives here will last. Empires shift, winds change, but the method will survive the building that houses it. Take in ideas from wherever they come. Honor them by checking them, improve them by use. Share them in a language wide enough that a stranger can add a page. This is a civilization's long bet that curiosity, organized, can pay for itself. Look again at the roof. A teacher points at a star and gives his class a number that matches the number another teacher writes in another city. They have agreed not on doctrine, but on measurement. That agreement is fragile and glorious. From it will come better calendars, more accurate maps, cleaner medicine, finer machines. From it will also come, in time, a soft thunder to Europe's west when travelers bring back tables, instruments, and the habit of saying, "Let us see if it is so." When you leave the house, you step into streets still busy at an hour when other cities sleep. A boy runs by with a bundle of paper. A girl carries a case of pens. Two men argue about the best translation of a word that means to cause to know. A call to prayer floats over roofs. A night baker slaps dough against a hot wall and grins at you because your hands are inked like his craft is craft, flour. Or words downriver. A boat slides into the dark with a chest chained shut. It holds a book of mathematics for a school in Wasit and a commentary for a judge in Kufa. The chain is not a shackle. It is a promise that the chest will not fall open. When the water grows rough, Europe has not vanished. Its lamps will grow again, fed by embers that monastic hands kept alive and by sparks that travel from this city like stars shaken from a sleeve. For now, sleep to the sound of quiet pages turning, to numbers balancing. Two lenses being ground, two translation read aloud and agreed. In your room, the fan is steady. In Baghdad, the lamps will burn a little longer, and when we wake, our path will bend back to the shores of the cold northern sea, where mists hide longships and monasteries learn to run with their libraries on foot. Turn the lamp down to a glow. Keep the fan at that soft ocean hush. Tonight the shore is a line of breath between world's mist rock, a bell that should be, calling monks to prayer but stutters into silence. You are standing on the edge of Northumbria in the year 793, where the sea is pewter and a small island called Lindisfarne keeps. More books than swords. All day the monastery smelled of salt, ink, and wet wool. A brother rinsed quills in a clay dish. Another warmed a stiff hand over a brazier and bent back to the gospel he had been illuminating for months knots, of color woven so tightly that a single line could lose itself and still find its way home. The abbot had a list in his sleeve. Flour, lamp oil, vellum, one good knife for scraping parchment smooth. It had been a good winter for copying. The storage chest clinked with clasps and bosses, not coins. Mist seals sound until it doesn't. The first noise is not a war cry. It's oars, muffled, regular, like a heartbeat that doesn't belong to you. Then hulls slide out of the grey longships, low and purposeful, dragon heads carved to keep the sea itself alert. The monks on the wall do not speak. They have heard rumors from the north coasts, smoking. Small churches stripped to bone, and they know at once why a monastery makes a good target. Even the poor ones are rich in portable treasure. Silver from altars, gold leaf from reliquaries, and books, which a man in a far city will pay well for even if he cannot read the words. We will not linger in the violence. The human body has only so much adrenaline in it, and you came here to sleep. What matters, for our story of knowledge, is what happens just before the axe finds the door. A brother call him Cuthbert. For the saint whose bones once rested, here sees the line of boats and does a simple, brilliant thing. He takes the nearest manuscript, not the most beautiful, but the one most copied from, and he puts it in a bag. The bag matters. In the book world of the islands, every high monastery keeps leather satchels for traveling gospels, straps long enough to cross. A chest in a hurry. Books do not run on their own, but these monks have rehearsed how to make them run. Cuthbert slings the satchel, nods to another brother who is already lifting a small chest by its handles, and together they pass through a side gate into reeds and fog. Behind them, a bell rings once, again, stops. This is the beginning of moving. Library's knowledge that refuses to sit still when boats do not, either. After Lindisfarne, the coast learns new habits. At Iona, on a rock out in the Western Ocean, a scriptorium that once painted letters as if they were angels now draws lines under lists. What to hide first, where to go, which path across the bog will keep a foot from breaking through. Monasteries teach their younger brothers to carry a book like a baby spined abreast, head protected, never by the foredge where pages fan and tear. They practice what to grab, the Gospels used at the altar, the Collectania compilations of medicine, farming, law, and bits of older science that a region depends on when a midwife needs a recipe or a miller a measure. They know that a smaller pocket gospel can save a soul on the road, and that a thick lectionary will drown you if you panic in a stream. They learn to leave behind what can be recopied from memory and to rescue what cannot. The Vikings are not ghosts. They are men with families, traders as well as raiders, navigators who read a coastline the way a scribe reads a page. They know where wealth flows because they have followed the trade routes that carry furs, amber, and books between cold north and warm south. They strike fast because it pays. Monasteries become targets because brick prays poorly with a spear and the doors open to the poor. A system designed to welcome has to learn how to withstand. So Europe's windswept edge changes its architecture. In Ireland, thin round towers sprout beside churches like stone needles threaded with hope belfries and beacons. Yes, but also ladders pulled up when sails are sighted, rope hoists that lift chests toward narrow windows when the courtyard is no longer safe. In Northumbria and across the Irish Sea, outposts pick higher ground and hide their entrances. Coastal priories pair with inland houses. If one is struck, the other receives its books and brothers, as if the island's veins have learned how to clot. Scriptoriums adapt. The grand, slow manuscripts, the ones whose pages are carpets of color, give way, in seasons of danger, to leaner copies. Abbreviations multiply, not sloppily, but systematically, the way a fast runner shortens stride on gravel. Margins carry directions as well as glosses. If danger, see Brother Finn at the mill. Copy this part first. Scribes invent lists of exemplars which book came from which, so a loss can be repaired by requesting the parent text from a friendly house to day's walk inland. The wisdom is simple. Don't keep all your gospels in one basket. Duplicate essentials. Distribute risk. Sometimes the storm brings gifts. A raider sees a gospel adorned with gold and thinks ransom, carries it across the sea, and sells it in a city where a librarian, who cares nothing for saints but everything for script, adds it to a collection that will outlive him. A Norse leader hires a Latin-lettered clerk because letters can count tribute faster than runes can. A young warrior with an eye for secrets traces lines in the dust, while a captured monk draws the alphabet for him. And in that exchange, a slow door opens. Literacy has long, surprising tributaries. The Vikings settle as well as strike. In the riverlands and estuaries of England, the Danelaw grows a patchwork of farms and market towns with new names and old stone churches whose bells resume their hour-keeping under a new lord's tolerance. Trade tents rise where boats can nose up to a bank. Craftsmen from the north share metalwork tricks. Local wives teach these men how difficult soil softens when you plow it in strips. Children grow up hearing two words for the same tool. A scribe, beside a hearth, copies a homily, looks up when the door opens, and is no longer entirely sure which language he will hear. Knowledge does not only flee raters, sometimes it marries them. Back in the cloisters, fear writes its own kind of literature. Colophants, the little note scribes, add at a book's end a choir, a tremor and a bite. I wrote this with a troublesome pen under great peril. Pray for me. The sea wolves are near. A margin picks up a date that will later hang like a bell. In this year, the heathen pitilessly destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne. The lines are not history as moderns keep it, but they are coordinates human. Immediate pinning books to storms so future readers know the weather. Their pages survived. Let's walk with one manuscript in particular, not a famous one. A working book that smells of oil and wool. It's a herbal, a collection of remedies and plant drawings copied and recopied from older Roman notes, local cures, and the careful experiments of monks who got tired of losing people to fevers. When the island hears that drumbeat of oars, the infirmary pulls the herbal as if it were a rope to a lifeboat. He doesn't hesitate. He knows what winter will ask for when winter comes. Not a jeweled cover, but instructions for sage and honey. A poultice for burns. A word of caution against a leaf that looks helpful and isn't. He shoves the herbal into a satchel and runs the goat path. The book thumps his ribs, heavy as a small child. When he reaches the low stone wall, a fisherman's boy reaches a hand and holds him over because, at the edge of the world, everyone understands Tria. He leaves the island behind without the silver from the altar, but with the pages that will keep a fever from taking. Half a village in March. The choice is not holy versus worldly. It is triage versus regret. Elsewhere, a different house tries a different tactic, burying in dry ground. Leather-wrapped chests go under floors, under flagged stones, under a layer of straw tamped so flat that even a careful boot cannot hear the hollow. Some of these caches will be rescued a week later when the danger passes. Some will sleep until spades from another century find them, the leather gone and the metal green, the parchment softened but legible. The monks did not plan to send a letter to the 12th century. They planned to survive Saturday. Time makes its own deliveries. Not all adjustments are defensive. A few are architectural inwardness turned up to 11. On a jag of rock west of the Irish coast, monks on Skellig Michael build hive-like cells of stone, beeskeps, big enough for prayers and a bed. Wind peels the sea into slate. Rain arrives sideways and does not apologize. No raider with sense wants to climb those steps in armor. The books here are not many, but they are siphoned. The sheer difficulty of reaching them teaches. A lesson Europe will absorb, put some knowledge where only patience can go. In the long run, the raids do something paradoxical to learning. They decentralize it in a way that makes it more resilient later. Early medieval libraries had tended toward fat centers, one great chest, one great shelf, one great scribe, whose hand could be recognized across a century. After the ships come, the same number of books might be split between 4 houses, each maintaining a copy of the crucial texts. When one falls, 3 remain. It's the same principle shipwrights use. With planks at a hull's seam, overlap them so a single crack is not a catastrophe. Knowledge learns to overlap itself, and copying gets faster without getting careless. Monastic communities refine their script insular hands still curl and sparkle in quiet years. But in busy ones, a plain bookhand wins the day. Abbreviations are dispassionate, Tyronian shorthand for, and is a stroke that saves seconds. Standard signs for therefore, which, because shave minutes. A scribe who once made letters into jewels now makes them into roads, not dazzling, but covering ground you need to cross before dusk. Across the channel, a king with too many enemies and not enough sleep feels the same pressure from another angle. Alfred of Wessex, bookish, tired, stubborn, decides that defense is not only walls and fights peasant armies, but schools and translations. He invites scholars from abroad, translates Latin works into English himself, and sends copies to bishops. For the sake of those who cannot read Latin, while Vikings bend the coast, Alfred bends the curriculum. The result is poetry that can carry law, homilies that can carry history, prose that can carry science, not yet bold, not yet theory-rich, but carrying all the same. Even in Scandinavia, the light changes. A boy who grew up on raids hears a homily. In a new tongue, he marries a local woman. Their child is baptized and taught letters, along with plowcraft. Runes remain on stones, but somewhere a clerk who once wrote on oiled boards takes up parchment. A generation or two later, in a cold island further west, poets will write sagas on calfskin, their own fierce encyclopedias of sea, law, winter, stubbornness, because somewhere a monk in a storm once refused to let a book be a hostage, stand once more on a headland and look down. You can't see titles from this height, only small human choices clinging to rock run, hide, copy, teach, share. You can't hear a scriptorium's prayer, only the ocean. But the ocean knows an equal when it meets one. Ink that flows, floods, ebbs, carries, and never wears out the way iron does. Night thickens. The long ships that came at dawn are already lines on the horizon. Sails like stiff wings, the wake behind them stitched shut by the moving sea. Down in the reeds, a mud-smeared brother opens a satchel and checks the book's boards with shaking hands. The clasps are unbroken. He lets out a sound that is not a hymn, but might be one if you gave it words. Tomorrow he will wash the mud from the edges, set the book by a fire, and begin to recopy the parts that smudged. He will also teach a novice where to stand when watch is called, and which hill climbs fastest, and how to pull a ladder into a tower after himself without dropping. The last rung. Storms do not love libraries, but storms teach libraries how to love movement. Breathe. The fan is patient. The shore is quiet. In our next night's walk inland, the swords will rest in stands, the gates will close at dusk, and an entirely different logic will take hold. World of oaths, acres, barns, and keeps where survival is king, and scrolls must earn their place beside the plough. Dim the light, let the fan turn like a slow mill wheel. Tonight we leave the sea and walk inland past hedgerows stitched with birdsong, into a patchwork of fields where knowledge does not wear robes or crowns. It wears dirt under the nails. You arrive before dawn at a manor, not a palace, but a working machine made of earth and habit. The house stands on a low rise, timbered ribs under a thatch cap, smoke curling where breakfast begins. Below it, the village is a handful of roofs, a stream with stepping stones, a yard where a smith's fire holds a coal-red heartbeat. At the slope's foot, fields curve in long strips brown, green, and stubble the three-field rotation in quiet conversation with the seasons, one sown in autumn grain, one in spring crops, one resting to gather back its strength. The Roman treatises never mentioned this exact dance. The villagers invented it simply because harvests listened. Out by the barn, a team is being harnessed. Not oxen alone, now horses, their collars padded wide so breath doesn't choke and work can be shared. Iron horseshoes gleam like crescent moons in a basket by the door. The heavy plough, iron-lipped and wood-shouldered, waits in the damp. When the team leans, the plough bites into thick northern soil with a deep, satisfying sound. Knowledge made. Of weight, watch the reeve the village's elected foreman walk his boundary. He taps a post with the handle of his staff, checks a sluice that feeds a water meadow, nods to a boy who lifts a hatch and lets the stream wet a grassy square that will keep cattle fed in February. He can't read a word of Latin, but he knows. The smell of a field that needs lime the way a smith knows, a bar that wants quenching. Sense sharpened by repetitions counted in winters, not pages. Up at the hall, a bailiff tallies obligations. There are few coins. Money is a shy bird in this century, so the accounting runs to rent in kind and labor days. So many bushels of barley after threshing, so many days on the Lord's domain, so much firewood stacked to the lintel before He writes it down in a practical hand. If he mixes Latin stems with local endings, no one scolds. What matters is whether the barn is full when snow arrives. You sit on a stool by the door and listen. The language in this room doesn't reach far, but it reaches deep. Words for soil types you've never heard. A half-dozen names for rain. Old names, stubborn names for winds that make ovens sulk and thatch rot. If Rome's knowledge strained across provinces like a web, feudal knowledge grows in roots, each word tapping a particular patch of ground. What you lose in distance, you gain in intimacy. Before noon, the Lord calls court in the moot. It is not a helmeted spectacle. It is a circle under an ash. Disputes over hedges and hens. A question of a broken promise about a piglet. A fight settled. Not by reference to a code in a silvered book, but by custom. What your father's father said was fair. And his neighbor agreed, and the whole village remembers. The steward speaks some Latin when the line needs sharpening. The verdict lands in the vernacular, because justice that cannot be understood cannot be obeyed. The court is a school of memory. People arrive carrying stories, leave carrying rules. Midday, the Lord's Hall opens its doors, and inside on the dais sits a man whose life has taught him that knowledge rides and fights. On a rack by the wall, spears lean in a row. Nearby, polished saddles, a mail shirt the color of rain, stirrups that make a horseman a platform rather than a passenger. The Lord's sons pop in and out, lanky with practice, wrists raw from the bowstring, hair damp with sweat from drills on the green. They can tie a hawk's jesses with gloved fingers and carve their names badly, then better, in a training board. Their education points outward to war because the map of their world is a patchwork of neighbors with overlapping appetites and thin tempers. In the afternoon, a small procession arrives, a vassal leading to mounted men, a chest on a cart, a banner rolled like a sleeping snake. The air inside the hall becomes careful. Homage and fealty are not poetry here. They are engineering. The vassal kneels, places his hands between the lords, and recites words that have been sanded smooth by repetition. A kiss, a charter, a promise, land in exchange for service, service in exchange for protection. A chain of human oaths forged with breath, not incanned yet as binding. Because everything from stored grain to unborn sons depends on whether those words stick. You're used to seeing knowledge as lines on a page. Here it is lines in wood. The new vassal's grant is a plank scratched with a plough drawn in profile, a mill wheel, a boundary tree, and for marks that everyone present can name. The clerk will copy this onto parchment when there's time, but the plank will outlast. A careless lamp. Redundancy is a virtue learned without a theory. Walk out to the smithy before dusk. Sparks climb like small stars. A boy works the bellows with a rhythm that gets to your bones. The master smith sets a horseshoe on the anvil and lets the hammer ring twice. Pause, once, pause, twice. Twice the pattern tells the apprentice, hot enough, strike here, leave the toe thick. Techniques here pass, cheek to ear, wrist to wrist, eye to eye. A gilded embryo lives in this hammering, though no charter hangs on the wall. The craft binds masters to apprentices with oaths as serious as any knights, but their field of battle is a glowing bar. When they argue, it's about temper and grain, not saints or empire crossed the mill. The water turns the wheel, and the wheel turns the stone, and the stone chews grain into flour with a sound like a slow rain. Millers are mathematicians of a kind, counting in sacks and shares. The Lord claims a fraction. The miller takes a toll. The villagers carry home what's left in sacks that smell like summer. It's arithmetic without numerals you would love, but it is exact at the granary door. The ledger here is weight, and the women watch them closely. A lady of the manor sits by a window with a tally stick and a little box of seals. She can read enough to match names to rents. She can add well enough to know when a steward is skimming. Her husband prefers hawks and hunts. She prefers accounts, not because she loves numbers, but because full cupboards are the difference between quiet winters and hungry ones. In the village she moves like a conductor signing cheese, where a baby's cry is thin, quietly sending a sack of barley to a widow's step, arranging for the midwife's daughter to sit near the hearth and learn letters with the chaplain. In a century where men praise battle, women keep the books that keep the swords sharp. The chaplain himself is new to the manor and anxious in his shoes. He can sing the office and mutter through a page of Augustine. He can comfort the dying and baptize in a hurry. But when the steward hands him a Latin letter about rights to the riverbank, he squints and wishes aloud for a better school. He is the hinge between two worlds, the church, where books live, and the field, where bread does. He makes mistakes. He learns. He teaches a few boys to shape letters and a few girls to keep house tallies in a hand that would not please a scholar and pleases their mothers. Fine. Notice what knowledge looks like when coin is scarce and travel dangerous. It gets short. It gets useful. It sits near the fire and is handed to the person who can use it today. Laws are remembered in proverbs. Engineering is remembered in a wall that never falls. Medicine is remembered in a recipe that works on this riverbank, in this climate, with this leaf. There is genius in this, but also a ceiling. Far-off minds cannot easily compare notes. Discover that their fevers are the same fever. Test two remedies side by side. Write a letter across a continent that says, try it this way. The world hums with local maxima high points that do not yet connect into a ridge. Castles rise, not the storybook ones yet, but Motte Bailey keeps a steep earthen mound with a wooden tower, a palisade around a yard full of chickens and worry. Carpenters learn curves that hold, stairs that don't betray feet in rain, gates that fall fast and lift faster. Later, stone will arrive and masons will bring geometry with their chisels. For now, timber teaches load paths by creak and crack. Siege knowledge grows with equal vigor. How to starve a keep, how to sap a wall, how to bargain for a door to swing. At midnight, it is science with mud on it. At night, the hall fills with breath and story. A harp, a low song about a battle none of these children saw. A saint's life told in a voice that remembers every place the river bends. The minstrel is a librarian without shelves, his brain a card catalogue of tales that carry law and caution, and courage in their verses. If the world will not send books, the world will make men into books instead. Around the edges, travelers do what libraries used to do. A peddler brings a rumor of a better millstone. A soldier from far away shows a belt buckle whose clasp teaches a smith a new trick. A pilgrim gives a woman a recipe for mending cracked pots with egg white and ash. The door, open, is a university of small, honest lectures. You might be tempted to call this a retreat from intelligence. Don't. Watch the field tomorrow and you'll see experiments every hour. Where to place a beehive so spring comes sooner to a row of peas. How to turn a furrow so frost lifts faster. How to dry a wall of bricks so they don't split in surprise. When knowledge is poor, it chooses profit in days, not years. It is not less clever, it is closer. Still, you can feel what's missing, what can't grow strong in a single village. A lens requires glassworks and patience and a reason for clarity to be worth the heat. A comprehensive book of plants requires travel, comparison, a neutral language, and a wealthy patron with the long attention of a monk and the purse of a prince. None of those live here yet. They will, in time, when roads are safer, charters give towns the right to market and mind their own, and coins find their way back into ordinary pockets. For now, the manor is a faithful engine, humble, effective, bounded. At the edge of the fields, the church keeps its hour. Bells rung by rough hands cut the dusk into parts. Work, prayer, sleep. The priest knows enough to keep the calendar right. The women know enough to keep the bread rising. The Lord knows enough to keep the roads passable where his men ride. There is a partition in this world. The monasteries, slow ink on one side, the manors, fast calluses on the other. They meet at the chapel door, and sometimes they quarrel about what matters more. Tomorrow's chapters will step inside the chapel to watch those keys turn, step back to the hill above the manor and look down once more. The fields are letters in a script that only the seasons read. The river is a sentence joining one village to the next. The road is a line of ellipses and finished thoughts that will someday reach a city. The castle is a period put there by fear. The mill is a comma that turns and turns. It is easy to love marble and miss timber. Don't. This age is building something no empire could complete. Habits that hold when the center fails. Oaths as infrastructure. Barns as libraries. A grandmother's recipe as a treatise on survival. When universities wake and presses start to sing, they will inherit this stubborn thrift of attention and turn it outward again. For now, let the hall's fire sink to coals. Let the reeve count lanterns against foxes. Let the lady close her box of seals with a soft click. Let the smith bank his forge and turn the bellows one last time, because his ear can hear whether the coal is comfortable. Sleep in a world where grain comes before grammar and walls before words. Not because words are despised, but because winter is punctual and children are hungry. Tomorrow, we'll cross the chapel threshold to meet the gatekeepers, the minds, that kept books chained to desks and, for better and worse, kept the keys. Lower the lamp. Let the fan hum like a distant choir. Tonight we step off the muddy manor road and through a small, iron-bound door. The stone is cool under your fingers. The hinges breathe a little. You enter a place where time is measured in psalms and paragraphs, where footsteps know which flagstones creak, where the world is divided by bells, matins, lauds, prime, tears, sext, nun, vespers, compline. Between these hours, ink moves, the corridor smells of wax and wool, and the clean sour of scraped skin parchment drying on a frame. A novice passes with a pot of gall ink and a bundle of quills tucked like a bouquet under one arm. He nods, eyes down. This is not shyness, but a bitter rule that keeps a house running. When winter and worry press at the gates, the scriptorium is a long room under a steep roof. Light falls in careful ration through high lancets. At each desk, a scribe sits with a board, a knife for trimming quills, a pumice to soften rough spots, a plummet line for ruling margins. Every motion wastes as little as possible. Parchment is dear. Time is dearer. Before a single letter, there is geometry. Pages ruled, lines counted, quires gathered so signatures meet properly when sewn. If a leaf tears, it is not thrown away. It is turned, patched, written around. Waste is a sin here because survival is frugal. Listen, you can tell the work by the sounds. The thin scratch of pen on good vellum is scripture or the fathers. The thicker, slower drag on rougher pages is the homily for Sunday, the local cartulary, the accounts for rents in kind. A second rhythm prick, prick. Prick marks a corrector's awl, dotting a margin where a line slipped or a letter went. Proud, the correction marks are small and consistent. This house follows a correctory, a master copy with the right spellings for names, the right figures for a feast day that moves. It is not glamorous work. It is memory's plumbing. In the far corner stands the armorium, the book cupboard. Its doors are thick. Its key is heavy and lives on a ring at the librarian's belt. When he unlocks the doors, he reads the spines, and boards not like an owner, but like a host checking guest rooms. Books here are chained to their desks, catenae not as insult, but as infrastructure. A book must be where a reader expects to find it. A missing volume is not just a theft, it is a broken tool chain. On some first pages, a monk's hand has added a curse borrowed from older houses. Whoever steals or unbinds this book, may he be anathema. The line is theatrical and practical all at once. Fear and love do the same work. We are used to thinking of church as one. Inside these walls it is many. The days are obedient. The choices are not simple. Imagine the librarian older, careful, with fingers permanently grey at the tip standing before the armorium with a list. Winter is coming, vellum is short. 3 requests outweigh the budget, which gets copied this season. A young schoolman from the cathedral school has asked for Aristotle's On the Soul, with a commentary that travelled west through 3 languages. The infirmera has begged for a clean herbal and a set of antidotes against fevers that cheerfully ignore feast days. The abbot, who has the cure of souls and the care of donors, wants more Gregory, more Augustine, and the lives of the saints that the parish can actually understand. What do you do with scarcity when the stakes are so different? The librarian rubs his forehead and chooses, because choosing is his work. Gregory is certain, feasts must be kept. Sermons need a backbone. The herbal is urgent. Bodies fail before minds do, and people will come with burns and bites. Aristotle, if copied, will arrive with glosses bristling like hedgehog spines and questions that some preachers consider dangerous tinder. Not forbidden, perhaps, but delayed. The librarian sighs. He is not a villain. He is a triage nurse for a library. Walk the room. A scribe illuminates an initial with a blue made from ground azurite. The letter shelters a tiny scene, a shepherd, a lamb, a hill that looks suspiciously like the one outside this very abbey. The margin grows vines, a dragon peeks, smiling. This is not frivolity. It is attention doing what attention does, finding delight where it can. Another desk holds no gold at all. Its occupant is copying a Polyptichta estate survey that tells this house exactly how many acres lie under plough, how many pigs eat the mast in the wood, how many cheese wheels the tenants owe at Michaelmas. Monasteries are souls and spreadsheets. Step into the library proper. A long hall, window bays with desks, chained volumes open like patient birds. On a stand near the center sits a glossed book, the main text large and dark in the middle, the margins alive with smaller hands, glossa ordinaria, the standard comments and aids. It is a 2-century conversation preserved on a single leaf. A new reader need not be brilliant to be guided. The margin will tug his sleeve. Notice this, compare that. Here the Greek means pity the margin, no praise it. Without those small voices, a difficult page becomes a cliff. With them, it becomes a path. But walk a little farther and you find the Armorium Clausim, the closed cupboard. Its contents are not for general circulation. Some works are suspect, not because they're evil, but because they require careful hands. Pagan authors, useful for grammar, medical treatises with frank anatomy, commentaries that tug too strongly toward metaphysics, where the abbot prefers. Morals, the key is the same iron. The rules are stricter. A master may consult them, a novice may not. Knowledge here wears a collar. You hear voices from the chapter house next door. A meeting. 2 older monks arguing in soft, tight phrases. The question before them is exactly the one you feared. What is knowledge for? One says, to serve the rule. Prayer, obedience, silence, charity. The other answers, to serve God by truth, wherever it is found. Both think they are protecting the same treasure. Both are right, both are wrong. The abbot listens, with his lips pressed thin. He will err on the side of peace, because communities die before libraries do, and libraries cannot copy themselves. The school in town borrows this tension and turns it into method. A master in the cloister school reads a sentence aloud, lectio slowly, twice. Then he poses a quistio, a specific question meant to pry the sentence open. The boys write on wax tablets. After dinner comes disputatio, ordered argument. Objections are raised, replies offered, distinctions made. It is fencing with reasons. The master ends with a determinatio, his resolution of the knot. This scholastic dance, lectio, disputatio, determinatio. A determinatio is a way to let dangerous ideas enter a safe room. It acknowledges what the librarian lives. Ideas are tools, and tools can cut. You will have heard of books chained to desks and imagine cruelty. Stay a night and see a different chain. Time, the bell, interrupts every deep dive. A scribe in flow must put his pen down at vespers. A brilliant argument in the chapter house stops at the word compline. This rhythm is not always kind to genius. It is consistently kind to ease. No one thinks well on no sleep. The chain makes sure the baker bakes, the cow is milked, the gate is shut. The wonder is that so much thinking happens inside a schedule that looks, from outside, like a net dot. There is also fear here. A rumor arrives from another city. A bishop condemned a list of propositions some masters were teaching theses declared. perilous or erroneous. The monastery schoolmaster reads the list twice, finds two of his favorite arguments among them, and goes very still. He is not accused, he is advised. He crosses out a passage in his own notebook, writes cave beware the margin, and teaches the safer route. He is not a coward. He is a gardener who doesn't let frost take the whole garden when he can throw a cloth over the tender plants. Not every gate is a wall. Some are lenses. A young monk loves poetry more than prudence. The abbot, wiser than his scowl, sets the boy to copying Virgil for grammar and Boethius for music, and then tells him to write a saint's life in verse. The poetry learns a better purpose. The theology learns a better shape. The boy grows up to write sermons people remember because the words fit. Control, in this house, often works like that. Not a fist, a frame. And yet there are losses, small and large. A leaf is scraped palimpsest to reuse parchment. And beneath today's sermon live ghostly lines of Archimedean geometry or a half chapter of a history. No one remembers to miss until a century later. A practical choice on a wet Tuesday creates a hole in a library that doesn't ache until Wednesday 100 years on. We want villains for that ache. We usually find circumstance instead. In the infirmary, knowledge has no time for metaphysics. A lay sister boils linen. A monk steepens willow bark in a pot. A child with a fever sleeps under a thin blanket while a window is unlatched to invite air. The herb garden outside is tidy. Sage, rue, costumary, labels on little tablets so a novice can find things by moonlight. The sisters keep a Labellasa little book of remedies annotated with what worked here in this climate with this water. The page on burns is dark with the touch of many fingers. The church's gatekeeping relaxes most in houses where people suffer. The rule bends because it was written by people who have suffered to dot what is preserved, besides pages, habits. The habit of dating what you write so a future reader has a peg to hang you on. The habit of naming your sources, even if the name is the old book in the second cupboard. The habit of writing ex libris from the books of so a volume finds its way home after a journey. The habit of prayer before copying and thanksgiving after, so the work owns a beginning and an end. These are small, tender engineering choices that keep systems from fraying. At dusk, the librarian relocks the Rhyme. He touches each key once around the ring as if counting rosary beads. A novice returns, a borrowed homily, and, without being asked, notes in the ledger that the book came home with a broken clasp repaired. Trust here is not naive, it is supervised. The chain on a book is not a statement about readers' souls. It is a simple concession to the fact that hands are forgetful and markets tempt even monks who need shoes. Step back into the cloister. A breeze runs its fingers through the grass in the garth. The reader for supper clears his throat and begins to read. He will not stop for laughter or tangents. The community will eat in silence and let the book feed them the way bread does. Where else in this century could a traveller sit and hear Augustine or Gregory or a careful homilist reciting what a poor man in the third pew will understand on Sunday? Knowledge here kneels and serves, which is not the same as bowing and fearing though. Sometimes, admittedly, it blurs. You will want to judge. Hold that impulse the way a scribe holds a blotter over a wet word lightly. This house kept a page alive in a winter that did not care for pages. It filtered, it preserved, it fenced, it fed. It saved a book you love and lost a book you wish. It taught boys to argue and men to yield. It made mistakes in the direction of continuity when you leave by the iron-bound door. The ring of keys clinks once, like a small bell. The fan in your room keeps its even breath. The night outside the abbey is dark, but knowing is warm somewhere inside. Chained not by malice, but by method. Guarded not by dragons, but by women and men who thought that if there must be a lock, then let the key hang where someone responsible can reach it. Sleep. Tomorrow we'll follow the key into town, where schools swell into universities, where arguments move from cloisters into halls painted with stars, where parchments turn into licenses and disputations pull crowds like fairs. The gate will swing wider, not vanish, but widen under the noise of thinking will begin to sound like cities. Lower the lamp. Keep the fan steady, like parchment breathing on a winter night. The road that left the abbey gate has emptied into a town lane stitched with vendors' cries, bells from many towers, and the soft undertone of 1,000 students all talking at once. You are in a century that loves questions so much it builds houses to contain them. They call these houses studia generalia, at first places where learning is for everyone who can get there. In time, the word will settle into your mouth. As university. Dawn leans pale over Bologna, a baker's peal clacks, a mule snorts steam. A boy with ink on his fingers hurries past with a roll of parchment bound in red thread. He's not a monk, he's a student, poor, hungry, proud, and the roll he carries is Roman law reborn. Lines from Justinian's great code, glossed and reglossed until the page looks like a city scene from above, straight roads of text, side streets of notes, tiny courtyards of counter-argument. In a crowded room, up a narrow stair, a master in a dark hood raps the table and begins Omnis definitio. In George Chivoli, periculosa est. Every definition in civil law is perilous. The boys laugh because the line is both warning and invitation. The glossators in Bologna have a gift for this, staking a fossil and showing you the creature that once lived inside it. A parchment opens to a square of Corpus Iuris Civilis, ringed with comments by Anerius and later Accursius, words braided so tightly that the margins look like lace. The point is not to memorize penalties and procedures. It is to learn a habit to read thick, to hold a center text and a dozen voices in your mind at once and not drop any. If Bologna is law, then Paris is theology and arts. You come up from the river into streets that smell of tallow and roasting chestnuts and something like ambition. The Isle de la Cite glints with Notre Dame's stone. The left bank buzzes with schools, some in rented rooms, some in cloister walks, some in tavern attics where the ale is cheaper if you promise not to sing after The students organize themselves into nations: French, Norman, Picard, English, which will shelter Germans once politics turns, because in a world without ID cards, your accent is your passport and your protection at the heart stands. The Faculty of Arts, a gate all must pass to get higher degrees. Boys, some truly boys, others bearded men who've ploughed fields fill benches worn smooth. The master reads Lectio from a book of Aristotle that only recently crossed the Alps entire, trailed by Arabic commentaries like bright moving fish. He passes a sentence, then flips the page and shows you how Avros read it, how Avos nudged it, how a monk named Albert down the road disagrees, politely but firmly. After lunch, they turn the room into a disputation, formal as chess, sharp as flint. A student stands to pose the quaestio, whether the intellect is one for all humans. Murmurs, heads tilt, objections rise, replies knock them down, distinctions. Slice the air thinner and thinner until you can see daylight through a concept you thought was solid. Above, arts rise, three high houses: theology, law, canon, this time, and medicine. Theology is a mountain, windy, beautiful, dangerous, where a master will spend decades writing a summa or commenting line by line on Peter Lombard's sentences, because that is how you learn to hold the whole forest in your head without losing the trees. Medicine is a steadier road, paved with the canon of Avicenna, Galen in learned translation, and practical notebooks from Salerno and Montpellier, where herbs meet anatomy and bedside judgment humbly corrects the page. Canon law sits between heaven and town hall, stitching Gratian's decreedom to the confusions of real parishes and prickly bishops. A jurisprudence of souls. A university is not a building, it's a guild. Sometimes of masters, as in Paris, sometimes of students, as in Bologna, always of people who have decided that knowledge is a craft with standards, oaths, and tools. The guild asks a prince for a charter or a pope for a bull, not for vanity, but for protection. Teachers want the right to teach without every sheriff and bishop tugging at their sleeves. Students want safety from rowdy soldiers and opportunistic landlords. Out of that need comes a durable invention: the licentia docendal, license to teach, portable power that says, this person may teach anywhere. The town host and adversary learns the value of brains that do not yet earn wages. On market morning, the stationer's street is loud with the business of books. Here, a system blooms to solve the bottleneck of copying. They call it the Petra system. A master text sits with a licensed stationer, broken into quires. Students rent a quire, copy fast and carefully, then return it for the next set. The result is a kind of prepress, dozens of copies in parallel, errors reduced by constant comparison, prices pulled just low enough that a poor kid with fast hands can build a library one quire at a time. You can smell the glue, the leather, the lamp smoke on those quires when they come home to a shared room and a cold stew. Follow a bell to the Sorbonne, a college founded for poor theology students who need more than good intentions to stay alive. College here does not mean the whole university. It is a Hauser discipline of eating at set hours, sharing heat, keeping silence so minds can work. In England, a canon named Walter de Merton will refine the model, endow lands whose rents feed scholars forever, bind them by statutes kinder than a monastery's and stricter than a tavern's. Give them a library and a warden and a long patience. From such houses grow Oxford and Cambridge cities, whose maps are timetables, whose stones learned to listen. Arguments make news. In 1229, a Parisian brawl between students and tavern keepers blooms into a crackdown. The masters close their schools and strike. Classes go dark for 2 years, an absence like a missing river. The Pope eventually steps in with a bull, Scientiarum, that protects the university's rights and by protecting them gives birth to an idea. Learning should have jurisdiction, like a bishopric or a court. In Oxford, a later riot on St. Scholastica's Day turns the town into a battlefield of tankards and cudgels. The long, embarrassing quarrel ends in public penance and a charter that tilts power toward the gowns. Town and gown will never love each other cleanly. They will learn to negotiate rent, rules, the price of firewood, the right to ring bells after midnight when a master wants to argue just a little more. What did students learn? The trivium grammar, logic, rhetoric first, because you must learn to say a thought before you can think it well. Then the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, because the world is number, wearing different clothes. After that, Specialization. A student might sit 3 years in arts, pass his disputations with a stomachache, take his bachelor's degree, permission to teach the basics, then climb to master and beyond. Theology takes the longest. Law and medicine pay better, sooner. Everywhere, the same method hums. Define terms. List objections. Answer cleanly. Mark what you do not know. You will meet characters who make the air around them hum. Peter Abelard, brilliant and bruising, teaching under a tree with a crowd so thick the branches look like a green tent. He loves logic the way a smith loves sparks, and pays for both his pride and his courage. Thomas Aquinas. Large, quiet, systematic, making rooms in the mind big enough to let Aristotle and Augustine both breathe. He composes a Summa the way a careful mason builds an abbey in bays, with flying buttresses of argument, catching the weight where walls alone could not. Albert the Great walks fields to learn plants by their smell instead of their names. Roger Bacon pesters everyone about experiment. Try it and see like a polite thunderstorm. Hildegard, earlier and outside the guild, looks at the natural world and hears music. Maimonides and Avros, far from these rooms, argue with them across languages, and their arguments blow across the channel rolled in parchment tubes. Theology does not swallow everything. In halls lit by greasy lamps, natural philosophy stretches its legs. A master draws a diagram, a falling stone, a moving cart, a pendulum. He proposes that motion might obey rules as steady as those of syllogisms. A student named Jean Berry will later describe impetus a push, living in a moving thing like a fading echo ideas that years ahead will give Galileo a foothold. In a small room, away from eyes, a physician bends over a cadaver when law forbids it. Not because he despises law, but because he wants to know how a valve actually looks. In the observatory on the city wall, a clerk compares tables of the stars, and mutters that the numbers don't love Ptolemy as much as the preface says they should. Quiet heresies of method collect like dew. Money changes shape in towns like these. A student's purse is thin, a master's modest, but schools attract patrons. A bishop endows a scholarship. A king gives a privilege. A widow leaves her house to a college because boys with books ate at her table one hungry winter. Books are expensive, so they are shared. A college library chains volumes to keep its commonwealth intact. A stationer stamps a small sigil on the flyleaf of a rented pet, so the borrower can't deny the debt. Out of these many chords legal, economic, moral unrolls a rope you will recognize. Institutions durable enough to outlive their founders. And yet, remember the monastery's caution, gates matter. In Paris, a list circulates of condemned propositions theses. A bishop calls dangerous to faith or order. Masters adjust Salaby with a wince. Some argue bolder in Cameron closed sessions, trusting students to carry hot coals with thick gloves. Others thrive on safer ground. Logic for law, geometry for surveyors, astronomy for calendars that keep Easter accurate and taxes punctual. Censorship does not stop thought. It shapes the routes thought takes. The day's rhythm is not unlike the abbey's, only louder. A student rises in a rented bed with straw in his hair, runs to matins if he promised God he would, otherwise to a lecture with his cloak inside out. He eats pottage that tastes of onions and virtue, copies a choir in the pettier shop, argues in the lane, falls in love with a sentence a master wrote and adds it to a little commonplace book, bound in skin so thin it's almost like paper from the East. He owes his landlord 3 weeks' rent and his soul 3 good confessions. and he sleeps as if both might forgive him till morning. Across the Channel, Oxford grows from a knot of schools clustering around St. Mary's Tower. A quarrel with the town to much ale, two little patients drive some masters away. They walk east and found Cambridge, a university born of a sulk. That became a tradition. In Italy, Padua opens its doors when politics make Bologna uneasy. In Spain, Salamanca puts law and arts on a high plateau where winter sharpens thought. Prague, Vienna, Heidelberg buds universities like fruit suddenly ready on a dozen boughs. You can feel the countenance circulation returning. A grammar learned in Paris helps a lawyer in Naples draft a contract a merchant from Bruges trusts. A physician trained in Montpellier recognizes a fever in York because it looked the same in Arles. A theologian in Cologne and another in Toulouse can argue about grace by mail because both read the sentences in the same order and know where the other man's paragraph starts to breathe. The language problem that once scattered Europe is not solved, but it is bridged by method, by standard texts, by a profession that wears the same gown in many weathers. What, then, did the universities save? Not marble or armies. Procedures. The expectation that a claim should meet an objection in public. The habit of copying with checks. The rule that a student may ask his master a question and receive something more than a scowl. The sense that a book is not a relic but a tool, a thing. You open, test, mark, improve, and they gave us a picture. You can still see if you close your eyes. A crowded hall, an argument hung like a lantern in the center, and faces turned up to it with something like joy. Evening leans long over the river. A bell tolls for the bell. The tavern promises a bowl of soup to anyone who can recite a stanza of verse. The stationer shutters his window on a neat pile of petcha, labeled in a hand you will learn to recognize by the second week of term. A master puts out his lamp and touches the page where he stopped so he can begin there tomorrow. Somewhere, a dean counts fines and sighs. Somewhere else, a poor student pins his last coin to his sleeve so he won't spend it on foolishness and calls it a discipline. The city exhales. The fan beside your bed keeps the rhythm. Sleep. In the morning we will ride south and west to Toledo and Cordoba, where translators with many alphabets in their mouths pull Greek and Arabic and Hebrew through the narrow door of Latin, and send the universities more to argue with than any one lifetime can hold. Lower the lamp, let the fan keep its river breath. Tonight, the road that left Paris lecture halls runs south, over the mountains where mules pick their steps through switchbacks of stone, and down into a country where three prayers share one skyline. In the streets of Toledo, Arabic tangles, gently with Romance and Latin. Hebrew letters shine on shop signs like quiet braziers, and the old mosque-turned cathedral holds cool shadows that still remember an earlier call. Here, knowledge changes, languages, the way a traveler changes, horses carefully. With a hand on the reins and an ear for temperament, you step into a long, whitewashed room set deep in the cathedral closer, summer-cool place where light arrives, sifted through high windows. The air smells of ink, wool, and pomegranates from the courtyard. 4 desks stand in a row like instruments, tuning for the same piece. At the first sits a scholar in a dark robe, his Arabic laid open Al-Majiz, the great book of the stars. The work you will learn to call Ptolemy's Almagest. He reads a sentence aloud in careful cadence, then turns to the man at the second desk, who renders it into the vernacular romance spoken in these streets, clear, nimble, close to the people's tongue. The third scholar, quill sharp, lifts that romance into Latin. finding terms that will stand inside a university without wobbling. At the fourth desk, a corrector compares the fresh Latin with a Greek fragment obtained at far cost, and with an older Arabic commentary that knows where the numbers usually land. Around them, young assistants compile glossaries Arabic to Romance, Romance to Latin small dictionaries that will outlive their hands. This is not one man's heroism. It is a method. In these rooms and others like them, in Toledo, in Seville, in Cordoba, in Palermo, under a Hohenstaufen emperor, curious as acrotemes practice the art of triangulation. They do not worship ancient pages. They interrogate them. If a line in the stars table disagrees with a known eclipse, they do not scold the sky. They put a pebble on the page and ask, where did we slip? If a Greek term for a circle's bow has no crisp Latin twin, they coin one, or pull a loan word through the door and dress it properly. Zenith, azimuth, Nade Arabic children given Latin shoes. If a proof in Euclid seems to float, they weight it with a diagram until it touches ground. At one bench sits a quiet, steady man, whose name your voice will wear softly, Gerard of Cremona. He came to Spain hunting a book he had only heard of. The Almagestan stayed long enough to translate more than 70 works. He is not a peacock of style, he is a harbour. From his desk, Galen walks in Latin. Hippocrates gets a coat that Paris will recognize. Al, Conrismex, numbers learn, too. Sit beside Roman letters without sulking. Gerard does not work alone. He stands on the shoulders of Mozarab scribes who grew up between tongues, on Jewish philosophers whose Hebrew moves easily with Arabic, on Raymond of Toledo. The archbishop who funds rooms like these because he understands that souls need law and numbers too. Across the city in a calmer house, a translator pauses over a book of light Kit Bolman ear. Ibn al-Haytham's book of optic sand speaks a sentence into the warm air. A colleague murmurs it back in Romance. A third sets it in Latin. Not sight rays go out from the eye, as the Greeks had it, but light enters, behaves, bends, can be measured. On another day, Aristotle enters, not as rumour but as a corpus, physics, on the soul, on the heavens, on generation and corruption, each with Avros leaning over the shoulder, explaining, arguing, correcting a copyist's sleepy hand from a century ago. These are not easy arrivals. Masters in Paris will have to make room on their shelves, and then in their syllabi, and then, with a sigh, in their feasts of argument. Travel east with your mind for a moment to Sicily, where Frederick II keeps falcons and questions in equal numbers. In Palermo, Greek, Arabic, Latin, and Sicilian walk the same courtyard. A translator named Michael Scott brings Avros into Latin the way a careful porter brings glass through a crowd to hands. Eyes up, gentle corrections when a shoulder jostles. In Salerno, physicians copy Avicenna's canon with margins full of seaside herbs. In Montpellier, students test those pages against patients and learn the difference between a sentence and a fever. Back in Toledo's market quarter, the booksellers, Warrakan in Arabic, stationers in Latin, have learned new habits. A master text sits under a cloth like bread dough rising. Around it, petio choirs go out and come back, rented and returned. So 10 students can copy Euclid at once and compare their pages over lentil stew. Prices do not fall like rain, but they lower like a rope paid out carefully. Enough that a bright student can own a line of Aristotle, a table of stars, a short treatise on numbers, and still eat on weekends. Listen closely, and you'll hear what Translation really sounds like it is not a single elegant voice, it is choral. A Jewish philosopher hums a phrase in Hebrew that catches the Greek's curve better than the street romance can. A Mozarab clerk suggests an Arabic term whose texture, once scraped and smoothed, becomes a Latin technical word that will last 500 years. A Dominican quietly flags a line that the bishop's list in Paris will soon call dangerous, and the team chooses a safer paraphrase that keeps the concept without lighting a fuse. The work is practical, patient, and beneath the ink stains tender. They are not just moving words, they are moving habits of thought. Some days are triumphant, like iron clicking into place. A student from the cathedral school brings a Greek scrap from a merchant's trunk, and the numbers in the margin correct an astronomical table that had been off by the width of a fingernail and a century. Other days are maddening. A single Arabic word hides 3 Greek possibilities, and the whole page wobbles until someone remembers a passage in Theon that slaps it steady. A scribe's flourish turns a plus into a minus. A proof collapses. The room groans, laughs, and starts again. The method survives the mistakes because it expects them. Drafts are saved. Margins confess. Errata lists are copied with the same care as the main text, because error admitted becomes a staircase. Not every translation is word forward. Sometimes the sense must travel in a coat cut for a new climate. Adelard of Bath, earlier and far-ranging, writes his nephew from across the water from the Arabs. I have learned to be led by reason. He does not drag Euclid across letter by letter. He brings geometry as a way of thinking. In Spain, Alfonso X, king with a scholar's envy, funds translations into Castilian first, then Latin later, so that clerks at court and craftsmen in cities can use the sky Alphonsine tables, born not just for the cloister but for the ship and the clock. Words arrive that the universities never had a proper drawer for. Zero, which looks like nothing and opens everything. Algebra, which invites you to hold what you do not yet know and still move it around like furniture. Algorithm, a man's name turned into a promise that a sequence of steps can tame a problem. Bigger than your hands. Sine, tangent, azimuth angles and arcs that let builders and navigators and dreamers share a page without shouting. Even rebuke arrives when needed. A translation of Aristotle's meteorology that is more poetry than pressure meets Arabic treatises that actually measure air and water. From the argument between them, a barometer will be born centuries later. Universities swallow this cargo with delight and heartburn. Lectures fatten, margins bloom. Thomas Aquinas builds rooms in his Summa where Aristotle and Augustine can sit and not glare. Albert sends students to the garden to learn leaf by smell. Roger Bacon insists, impolitely, that a lens in your hand is a better sermon than a page in your memory. In a year you can point to 1 to 77. A bishop in Paris publishes a list of condemned propositions, worried that Aristotle's engine is pulling the train off the tracks. Masters adjust. Some argue within the rails. Others learn to switch lines. At night, the condemnation chills some rooms and warms others. It pauses a few books and accelerates a different kind of courage. Look, test, keep notes. The traffic does not run only east to west. Letters go back, thanks, objections, new examples. A Christian master writes to a Jewish colleague about a stubborn passage in Avros. A Muslim physician in the Maghreb hears from a student in Montpellier who found a herb that speaks the same language under a colder sun. The Mediterranean behaves as it always has. A book with oars. Stand in the cathedral again at dusk. The stone remembers both Qibla and choir. In a side chapel, a translator lays down his pen and flexes the fingers that have held 3 alphabets since morning. He nods to the sacristan. They share a cup of watered wine without discussing doctrine. Outside, the walk shutters his store after counting choirs, and a boy with a satchel full of copied Euclid walks home past a lampsler whose brass bowls turn starlight upside down. Over the bridge, a musician leans on the parapet and plays a melody that steps carefully across modes older than the books below. You will be tempted to crown heroes and forget process. Resist for a moment. The glory here is not single. It is distributed. It belongs to the patron who pays scribes before he buys flags, to the Mozarab clerk whose romance is flexible enough to be a scaffold, to the Jewish philosopher who knows which Arabic term grew from which Greek seed, to the Dominican and Franciscan who carry the new Latin back to Paris and Oxford like warm bread wrapped in their sleeves, to the stationer who splits a master text into Petia and keeps the pile honest, to the boy who copies all night and then, half asleep, still dots the I in ratio dot. What changed because of these rooms? In a word, scale. Europe's thinking stopped being a village and became a network. A physician in York, faced with a fever that looks like a line he once saw in Avicenna, can reach for a page that exists in his own language with enough precision to try a remedy without guessing. A builder in Lubeck, shown a simple astrolabe, can learn the sky as a tool rather than a story. A theologian with a soft spot for metaphysics can now be specific about the soul's powers because Aristotle is not a rumor. And a student poor, cold, stubborn can, with a few coins and a fast hand, own a little library that talks to Cordoba at noon and to Alexandria at night. Losses happened too, and we should name them. Some Greek subtleties came bent through. Arabic and Hebrew and Romance before Latin straightened them as best it could. Some Arabic brilliance arrived without the experiments that had refined it, and so looked tamer than it was. Some translators, under pressure, smoothed edges that should have stayed sharp. Some patrons steered projects toward astrology when the city really needed algebra. But errors confessed make better maps. The next copy corrected. The next glossary grew thicker. The next team reached for a different manuscript and found it. Night gathers. On a flat roof, a young assistant tips an astrolabe up to the sky and whispers the star's name in 3 languages to help it stick. In a narrow lane, a scribe rubs the cramp from his wrist and ties a leather thong around a choir he will deliver. At dawn, in a quiet corner, a rabbi closes his book and smiles because a passage that always felt round finally has a word that is square enough to hold it. And in a room at the edge of the quarter, a woman who sells lamps counts her coins and decides she can spare one for her son's lesson tomorrow. Numbers, once foreign, have begun to pay. Let the fan keep its steady breath. Let Toledo's rooms empty without losing their heat. The bridges they laid will carry more than books' methods will cross too. Compare sources. Confess error. Coin words with care. Name your tools. Keep your tables. Those habits will matter when a different wind arrives from the east, not a caravan, but a sickness in Europe's new network must choose between panic and procedure. Sleep. In the next night's chapter, the streets will be too quiet. Doors will be marked. Ink will dry on desks no one sits at anymore. We will walk softly through the year of great mortality and watch what knowledge keeps. When hands are few and bells toll too often, turn the lamp down to a hush. Let the fan keep its soft, even breath. Tonight the streets are too quiet. Doors bear chalk marks and sprigs of bitter herbs. A cart goes by with a single wheel complaining, and even the dogs do not chase it. You step over the threshold of Florence, a venue own. York, name any city you like, and you arrive in the same hour. The hour when bells toll so often that time itself forgets what else it was meant to do. You remember the lively rooms of Part 9 Translators, arguing with the stars, and the crowded halls of Part 8, where disputations drew crowds like fairs. Now the same rooms are thinner. A lecture bench holds a cloak no one came back to fetch. The stationer still has Petra bundles on his shelf, but dust won't copy them. A scribe's desk is tidy in the way a desk becomes tidy only when a hand leaves it for good, knife laid across a pumice stone. Quill trimmed and waiting beside a word that will never meet its verb. We will not linger on bodies. We will sit beside books, because that is where our story breathes. But books are kept by people, and the plague takes people in clusters, families, guilds, whole choirs. The shock is not only grief, it is the sudden disappearance of competence. A monastery loses 2/3 of its brothers in 6 months, and with them goes the only man who knew exactly where the Augustin lived, the only sister who could make blue from lapis without making mud, the only clerk who could balance the rents. When payment came in eels and oats instead of coin, shelves remain. Memory, the catalogue you cannot shelve, evaporates. Walk with me into a scriptorium where work has paused because the air has. The benches look like empty pews. In the center, a single leaf lies out to dry, ruled in plummet lines and half-filled. With a hand you can already recognize Brother Alessandro's steady upright. You can see the place where his pen stuttered. A letter goes wide. The next line does not start. A novice has marked the choir with a red thread and written in a smaller, shaky script at the bottom margin. Orate pro scripturis anima, pray for the scribe's soul. Piety, yes, but also bookkeeping. A note for later hands that this copy stops here and must be resumed from there. The practical kindness of a thread. Outside the cloister, universities blink, stagger, and improvise, some close entirely, sending boys home on roads that have never seen so many students walking so quietly. Others shrink to a single master and a handful of stubborn pupils, disputing at distances a bell can barely carry. A dean writes in a ledger that this year's commencement will be deferred because those who were to confer it are dead. Another dean, stubborn as ivy, dresses 2 new masters in old robes and makes them make do. Degrees granted in these years arrive with extra creases, like letters folded too often in unsteady hands. Plague is a thief of time, and so the shape of books changes. When you do not know if next winter will come with readers or with pallbearers, you write shorter. Encyclopedias shrink into vade-mecums. Go with me handbooks. Treatises become tables. A chapter on fevers becomes a list you can tape to the inside of a chest. Sage plus honey, willow bark for pain, keep the air moving. Clerics who once wrote Latin for other clerics now address their own towns in the vernacular. Fast advice for people who need instructions more than elegance. The page grows plain on purpose. Flourishes matter less than legibility. A good hand is one a frightened neighbor can read by candlelight. Materials change too. Parchment patient, expensive cannot. Multiply fast enough for emergency's appetite. Paper, cheap and good enough, slips in like a practical cousin. Mills that thumped rags for cloth now thump rags for sheets. At first old habits sneer, Then the ledger smiles. A notary copies a will in paper because there are 10 to write before dusk. A town council drafts ordinances, clean the streets. Keep refuse out of the river. Shut the gate when rumor sails in a head of shipsand. Paper listens to panic without complaint. The plague does strange arithmetic to labor. When there are fewer hands, each hand is dearer. Wages rise where custom lets them. In other places, authorities try to freeze them with laws, and the market answers with a shrug. Serfs bargain, some walk, copyist. The ones who survive charge more and decline less. Women step into posts as stewards, keepers of accounts, shopkeepers of books and candles, because the men who held those keys aren't coming back. Literacy leaks out of cloisters into kitchens, not because bishops planned it, but because a widow learns the tally that keeps her children fed, and a daughter reads receipts so her mother won't be cheated of the rent. Watch the infirmary again. The herb beds have been thinned by grief and plunder, but the sisters do what books taught them to do before books went quiet. They observe. They mark on the walnut with ink, with scratches, how long the fever ran in the last wave. Whether the room with the window open or the one with the window shut kept patients calmer. Whether rosemary under the pillow comforted more than wine at the lips or the other way round. They keep a libellus of remedies, not as monument, but as memory device. Do this again. Avoid that helped Brother Thomas for 3 nights. It is not science as a university would define it. It is method without preface, and it keeps people alive. In the town hall, knowledge puts on a new uniform. Ordnance. Gates shut at dusk, and a passed parchment gives the watcher the right to open them, no exceptions for charm or coin. Markets shift outdoors. Butchers stand further apart. The city writes down which streets were swept and when. A magistrate appoints watchers to look after houses under mark and promises bread in exchange for patience, because patience is expensive. Port cities experiment with waiting 30 days, then 44 ships and men. The word quarantine hasn't settled yet, but the habit will. Knowledge becomes a calendar of caution. The church keeps vigil with paperwork as well as prayer. Parishes begin to keep registers more carefully, not because God needs a list of the dead, but because food and land and orphans do. A bishop orders that wills be witnessed by 2 clerks instead of 1. A monastery invents a new catalogue because the old catalogue died with the librarian. The new one is cruder, but visible big letters, red rubrics, a simple map of which cupboard holds which shelf. You will not be surprised to learn that some of these unlovely finding aids will still be legible when an elegant earlier system has mildewed in beauty. What about ideas? Do they rot? Some do. Projects that needed decades go hungry for months and die. A vast commentary patient as Ivy stops at Quistio 47 and never rounds the corner to grace. A translation team whose workflow was a marvel loses the member who knew 3 scripts before breakfast. The rest switch to safer texts until a new trilingual child grows up somewhere. But ideas also migrate. A friar fleeing a city wraps 2 books in his cloak and follows a road he never meant to learn. He ends up in a market town that never had a library and starts one. A physician who wanted theory opens a shop and collects cases instead. His ledger names withheld by dyspsy becomes a book that matters because it is full of numbers. Art learns to teach in the way sorrow asks it. On church walls, skeletons and nobles dance together in frescoes called Dance of Death. It looks like a scold. It is a mnemonic. Remember that your time is short. So make your confessions, mend your fences, copy the page you've been putting off. Teach the apprentice the trick you meant to keep as your distinction. Hug your children, spell your name carefully in the ledger so the steward doesn't lose your field. The ars moriendi, the art of dying, becomes a genre. Short books, practical and consoling, that teach parish priests to help neighbors die well. They are not philosophy, they are toolkits. Some forms of thinking harden under pressure and become habits. A city that never counted the living begins to count the dead and accidentally learns to tabulate. A monastery that never dated its copies precisely starts writing year and day on the first page because the abbot asked when, one too many times, and no one could answer. A cloth guild that always purchased by sight and squeeze begins to keep columns of figures because scarcity makes fraud expensive. In these columns and dates are the seeds of something that will later be called statistics, not theory yet, but arithmetic applied to human worry, and there is a quieter consequence. Mercy learns logistics. Almsgiving was once a private virtue and a public parade. Now it becomes organized. Confraternities store grain in good years. City councils fund hospitals whose business is more beds than sermons. Mendicant orders whose friars went where the people were even before the bells tolled. Turn into networks of information where food is, where the fever isn't, where a monastery still has a copy of a book another house needs. Charity acquires a map. The mendicants and the universities, so recently distinct, begin to share more than alleys. A Dominican master who spent his youth arguing about forms now writes tracts on how to nurse the sick and bury the dead without breaking custom. A surgeon who used to be scolded for too much experiment becomes the busiest. Lecturer in town, his class held in an open courtyard because the hall is hot and the air is a lesson now too. Students who thought their studies were a ladder beginning at grammar and ending at theology discover that a ladder is also a bridge you can carry what you learned in logic into the market when buyers and sellers argue about weights and measures. Even the margins change. The little voices that once whispered, compare, Avicenna here, start to add practical notes. This remedy worked in a cold spring. Do not use in pregnancy. The pulse is a better teacher than the neighbor's. Fear, the scribe's hand grows plainer. He thinks of the woman who will read this line with tired eyes after caring for 3 children and a husband who coughs. And he writes as if speed and clarity were the twin virtues they are. You might ask, did the plague set knowledge back? Yes and no. It broke chains of transmission. Fewer masters, fewer apprentices, fewer hands that knew the trick of turning a stubborn pigment into sky. But it also thinned the canopy so light could find neglected undergrowth. The price of labor let people leave fields where they were bound. Some took their brains to towns. Literacy learned to skip classes. The vernacular learned to do work Latin. Had hoarded, cities learned to write rules and keep them. Monasteries learned to label plainly, and in homes, a mother's recipe for comfort and a father's tally for fairness began to look quietly like chapters in a civic textbook. When the first wave weakens and the bells ring less, the surviving institutions recede. Universities recruit boys who were never meant to wear gowns. Cathedral schools relax their fees where patronage allows. Guilds formalize apprenticeships to rebuild their ranks. And in a few Italian towns, presses that once stamped cloth begin to think about stamping letters. The idea is not yet a press, not yet a man in Mainz bending over a frame of metal types. But necessity has whispered a prophecy. Copy more, copy faster, copy the same each time. Scarcity taught it. Mercy will fund it. Before we blow out the lamp, stand with me once more in that quiet scriptorium. A novice older now by 6 months, that feel like 6 years, ties a red thread on a new choir. He writes a date clearly names, the exemplar plainly, and notes in the margin that the infirmary requests this chapter first. He sharpens his quill, not to fine, because paper tears when you get precious. He takes a breath that sounds very much like your fan, and he begins where Brother Alessandro stopped, not because he thinks himself equal to the task, but because the line is there and lines are meant to be continued. Outside the street is not empty anymore. Children play a game that looks like tag but is really arithmetic with stones. A woman opens a shop that sells lamps to people who now read in the evening. A friar smiles because he has just been told that a lazaretto, a house by the water for the Sikh will be funded by the city, and that his job is to write its rules. In the east, beyond mountains and rumors, a city with walls as old as anyone can remember, faces, cannons, no wall has yet learned to answer. Its libraries hold Greek voices the West barely knows how to hear. Soon those walls will fall, and with them will come a river of teachers, carrying manuscripts like children, and children like manuscripts. Sleep. Tomorrow night we will stand on those walls and watch the last librarians of Byzantium choose which books to carry and which to trust to luck, and we will follow them west to workshops and gardens where Greek learns to speak to Latin in a new accent called Renaissance. Turn the lamp low. Let the fan breathe like a watchman on the wall. Tonight you stand above the Bosporus on a May evening in 1453. The city beneath your feet, Constantinople, queen of stubbornness, has outlived emperors and earthquakes. Its libraries have the slow heartbeat of a creature that remembers Athens without closing its eyes. But down in the moonlit plain, strange thunder mouths open cannons. The old stones learn a sound no wall was built to bear. On the battlements, the last emperor, Constantine XI, rides the line in armor that fits like a decision. In the alleys behind him, a different army forms, not soldiers, scholars. They move like people in a house where a fire has found the rafters, quickly, quietly, with lists. A thin man in a black robe ties up a codex with twine and tucks it under his arm. A scribe slips wax tablets into a leather satchel. A monk kisses the wooden door of a library and whispers the names of books like prayers. Plato, Sophocles, Ptolemy, Herodotus. He has time for 6, room for 3, and conscience enough to hate arithmetic. At a long table lit by a single lamp, an elderly scholar and a boy perform a triage older than medicine. On the left pile, duplicates, minors, commentaries that can be stitched again later. On the right, authorities in single witness texts that, if they burn, collapse a balcony in the palace of the mind. The boy points to a slender volume, Euclid, in Greek diagrams, clean as dawn. The old man nods once. The book joins the right-hand pile. He chooses Ptolemy's geography, not for the map of how things are, but for the method of measuring how they might be drawn. He slides a little Sappho up from beneath a commentary on Psalms and smiles like a thief forgiven in advance. The city falls, walls hammered open, gates splintered, the sea inside the harbor wearing enemy sails like new teeth. We step away, not to look away, but to follow what matters for our long story. The human wind bearing books west. You meet them on roads into Thrace, on ships that hug the Adriatic, in caravans that thread the Apennines. Bessarion, a bishop with the eyes of a sleepless librarian, George Gemistos Plathan, luminous and stubborn. who will make Plato sing in rooms that thought Aristotle had the monopoly on logic. John Argyropoulos, who can walk a Latin sentence backward while explaining a Greek verb to a boy named Lorenzo with ink on his cuff. They carry codices wrapped in cloth like infants, and infants wrapped in cloth like codices. They carry pronunciation, the sound of omega and eta, the little slide of a participle, so that when the West reads, it hears properly. Where do they land? In Venice, whose merchants can smell profit in paper and ink as keenly as in pepper and silk. In Florence, where a banker named Cosimo de' Medici buys manuscripts the way other men buy vineyards. In Rome, where papal secretaries have long hands and longer lists. In Padua and Ferrara, where universities have rooms that feel like workshops. You step into one of those rooms and find a table under a window and 3 men leaning over a page with the tenderness of carpenters checking a joint. On the table, Plato in Greek, a Latin translation that limps, and a new attempt, still wet. A young translator Marsilio Ficino takes a breath, reads a clause, and decides between a word that sounds holy and a word that sounds human. His patron Cosimo wants the whole Plato in Latin, the songs and the bones, not just the rumor. Project as improbable as building a bridge out of air. Ficino writes late, coughs early, prays, plays the lyre, and keeps translating. When he falters, Plethen's memory nudges him, make it sing. When he finishes a dialogue, Cosimo sends 4 more candles. Down the street, a different hunter moves. Poggio, Broccolin, long-legged, never happier than when his nose smells dust. He prowls monasteries, not for relics, but for reading lists, forgotten in cupboards. In 1417, years before the fall, he opened a box in a German abbey and brought Lucretius back into the world, like a man carrying a spark that knows what fire can do. Now, with Greek alive in Italy, Poggio's Latin finds company, texts begin to triangulate. A passage in Plato straightens a crooked Renaissance, Aristotle. A Greek Hippocrates pulls Galen out of a Latin knot he was tied in by a sleepy copyist in 1192. This is not just collection, it is correction. A cohort of humanists learns to handle the past like a crime scene. No touching until you've taken notes. A sharp man named Lorenzo Valla reads a Latin document that had crowned popes with ancient authority, the donation of Constantine. Here's the crack in its accent. The Latin claims to be 4th century. Its vocabulary smells 11th. Valla doesn't set it on fire. He sets it on grammar, and it collapses. What seems like a quarrel about church power looks, to us, like the birth of a habit you know well. Textual criticism, weighing voices, dating hands, letting evidence be boring and thereby true. Walk into a studio with plaster dust on the floor. A young man with ink on 3 fingers and mortar on the 4th. Filippo Brunelleschi draws a square and a line that bites the horizon. He has returned from Rome, where he measured ancient arches with a string and angered guards by climbing, where signs say no. Now he presses a pane of glass against Florence and invents a trick that is not a trick. Linear perspective. Put a vanishing point here. Draw lines like sunbeams from it, and a flat wall remembers space. Within a decade, painters will move saints through rooms you can walk inside with your eyes. Within a generation, a Tuscan named Leonardo will cut a skull and draw the chambers of the heart as if the body were a cathedral needing a plan. Art becomes a laboratory because geometry taught its tongue to tell the truth about light. Books learn to be books differently. Greek scripts leak full of music meets Latin squareness, and the two compromise on forms that a punch cutter can make from steel. In Venice, a lean scholar named Aldus Manutius, imagines a series of portable octavos pocket Plato's and Virgil in a slanting italic hand designed by Griffo, so that wisdom will fit a traveler's satchel and a student's allowance. You'll meet the press more properly tomorrow. For tonight, just watch how the desire for more readers invents graceful economy. The page gains margins where notes live like birds on a wire. Front matter grows a preface where editors confess sources and sins. The apparatus variant readings, stacked like pebbles at the edge of a stream teaches. Anyone willing, how fragile and fixable a text can be. Medicine climbs out of the commentary and back into the body. In Padua, Vesalius unfolds a human arm, like a patient map, and says quietly, but forever, look, first, quote, later. He loves Galen enough to correct him. He carves his name in the margin of a muscle. His plates are not only drawings. They are arguments that bones have a logic you can see. That an error repeated for 1,000 years is still an error. That reverence without inspection is the father of gentle lies. Astronomy hears a clink in the gears of the old Ptolemaic machine. An austere canon in Poland Copernicus reads Greek more comfortably than most men read their prayers. He combs Ptolemy, tastes Arabic tables, listens to Averroist murmurs about spheres, and feels the numbers grind like sand in a badly oiled clock. He asks a forbiddenly simple question. What if the sun stands still? He does not publish for decades, because good habits make cowards of some kinds of courage. But the scheme rings true the way a snapped chalkline does straight, even if unpopular. The world does not tip on its head in 1500. It tilts slightly and cannot tilt back in Florence. Meanwhile, humanism does its real work, not worshipping statues, but training readers. Ad fontes to the sources is not a slogan. It is a discipline. Learn Greek verbs until they wake you at night. Read Aristotle without a medieval intermediary, then put the intermediary back and thank him for keeping the chair warm. Ask what a word meant then, not what we wish it meant now. Out of this cranky love for correctness, 1,000 competencies bloom. Better laws, because Roman law is read like law. Better history, because Herodotus and Livy are read like witnesses rather than mascots. Better theology, because Erasmus prints a Greek New Testament, and the text stares back at the Latin with a look that cannot lie. Patronage, the Messianic taste. The Medici fund Ficinos. Plato, because they desire glory the way a vine desires trellis. But they also found libraries and hire catalogers who invent systems so books can be found by people who are not named Medici. In Venice, Bessarion bequeaths his Greek hoard to the city, and out of his boxes grows the Bibliotheca Marciana, a public promise in marble and silence. Lords and merchants and popes play chess with prestige, and libraries and studios are the pawns that become queens when they cross a board made of time. Do the old gates vanish? No, they move their hinges. The church still sets indexes and publishes corrections. Suspicious masters still prefer safe sentences to sharp ones. But where earlier centuries chained books to desks to keep them safe, this one chains methods to minds to keep them honest. A gifted painter is told to check his perspective. A canon lawyer must cite a folio. A surgeon must show how as well as what. A printer must list his errata without shame. Orthodoxy of doctrine, yes, but also of procedure shifts towards evidence. Step inside a Florentine workshop late. The master is gone, the apprentices stay. On one bench, a boy carves a tiny modulessa, proportional unit to carry from canvas to canvas, so saints don't change size when the patron blinks. On another, a girl mixes ultramarine with walnut oil and notes how long it takes to dry in a north window in February versus a south window in June. She is not allowed to sign the altarpiece. She signs the recipe. 50 years later, someone will thank her by using exactly that proportion on that wall and noticing the blue still singing where cheaper blues turn tired. Walk out into the street. You can hear Latin in a dozen dialects, Greek like water running over loose stones, Tuscan vowels, lemon bright, Venetian consonants, salty with trade. A bookseller stacks quartos in his door and tells a boy to mind the shelf where the Pliny sits. That copy cost a month of his life and 3 of his wife's smiles. Across the bridge, a map maker copies a Ptolemaic outline and then adds a headland a sailor swore was there. He writes a small note in the margin. Here be guesses. In a square, a friar preaches charity and, between 2 lines from Augustine, quotes a Greek moralist whose name he pronounces with bashful care. The crowd nods because the story fits. Ask yourself, what was forgotten and who remembered it for us? 1,000 things recipes of Roman mortar, the grain of a Greek accent. A way to tie a vault without trusting prayer alone fell into holes and were found again by hands that had never seen Rome whole. Byzantium kept a spine straight through a millennium and sent it to us when its ribs broke. The Islamic world kept eyes on geometry and medicine when we were counting sheep, and sent those eyes west through translators who understood that truth is a passport that should not expire. Monasteries kept the pulse alive. Universities taught the breath. Printers will give it lungs. The Renaissance is not a magic trick that pulls marble from a hat. It is a relay batons passed, in storm and calm, sometimes dropped, sometimes recovered. In the weeds by a child who didn't know he was saving the race. The fan in your room goes on, even patient. In Venice, Aldous leans over a proof of Aristotle and hears the sea argue softly with the pier. In Florence, Ficino sings a line from Plato and decides tonight to translate Plotinus because the soul wants rooms stacked higher still. In a little German town, a goldsmith is cutting letters from metal and testing a press that smacks paper like a satisfied baker smacks a loaf. He does not yet imagine that his types will make Ficino's Plato cheap enough for a tailor's son and a mason's daughter. He only knows that ink wants multiples, sleep. Tomorrow we will put our hands on that press and watch letters go from singular to swarm. We'll hear the squeak of the platen, smell wet ink and new paper, and feel the floor of history tilt as knowledge stops acting like treasure and starts behaving like bread. Turn the lamp low. Let the fan keep its even breath. Tonight, we press our palms against planks warm from work and smell the sharp, peppery bite of oil-based ink. We're in Mainz, mid-15th century, inside a room that feels part smithy, part chapel. On the bench, lead filings, a hand mold that closes with a satisfying click, a tray of tiny metal soldiers of BCD standing to attention. At the center squats a wooden press descended from wine and olive, a screw that brings force down slowly and evenly. The way patience brings a result when haste only brings splinters. Watch Johannes Gutenberg lift a narrow stick the composing stick and begin to set a line. Each letter is a typecast from a matrix cut by a punch cut by a steady hand. That little chain of decisions punch, matrix, type builds uniformity, and uniformity unlocks speed. He justifies the line, slides it into a steel frame, locks the page with wedges, inks the form with padded balls, and swings the bed under the platen. A A pull on the bar, a breath thunk, and a sheet takes an impression as clean and even as a prayer spoken by someone who means it. The miracle isn't that one page is crisp. A monk could manage that on a good morning. The miracle is multiples. When metal letters don't wear down after the first dozen impressions, you can roll the bar again and again until a book exists not as a lone monk's triumph, but as 200 twins pages so alike that a student in Paris and a notary in Nuremberg can point to the same line with fingers stained the same black. In an age that lost so much because it relied on hand copy and memory, sameness becomes a kind of mercy. Look closer at the page. New habits arrive with the ink. Title pages step forward like a handshake, telling you who made this and when. Page. Numbers appear so to people can talk across a breakfast table or a border without waving in the dark. Signatures, small letters at the foot of leaves help binders gather gatherings in order. Catchwords whisper the next page's first word to catch errors before they take root. Colophons confess time, place, and shop. Printers, marksankers, dolphins, globes become little vows of quality and pride. And then a hum begins. Print shops multiply. Journeymen carry the craft down river to Strasbourg, Cologne, Basel, across mountains to Venice and Milan, up to Paris and Lyon, over to Antwerp. Each city adds a local talent. Venice, with its paper mills and mercantile lungs, turns the press into an industry. There, a thin, exacting humanist named Aldous Manutius dreams, smaller octavos. You can slip in a sleeve and fast italic letters that save space without losing grace. He prints portable Plato, pocket Virgil, little Greek grammars that let a tailor's son taste syntax on the tram. The books inside changes too. Tables of contents lead you in. Indexes lead you back out with what you came for. Margins grow, apparatus variant readings stacked neatly. Errata lists that turn honest mistakes into public repairs. Scholarly argument steps out of the cloister and learns to walk with citation. Not I say, but see folio 73, column B. That small shift argument attached to coordinates makes knowledge checkable. And checkable knowledge is harder to lose, because any mind can walk to where it was put. Reading itself shifts under your feet. For 1,000 years, the most serious reading wore a habit or stood in a choir. Now it pulls up a chair in the kitchen. A mother holds a printed primer while the pot simmers. A goldsmith reads a trade manual and finally understands a flux recipe his master only half shared. A farmer buys an almanac weather, saints' days, planting tables, and finds the sky becoming a calendar he can keep in his pocket. Silent reading, once the trick of rare minds, becomes common. The room is as noisy as ever, but knowledge no longer requires the whole room to be quiet. Printers are craftsmen and also business people. They need licenses to print, privileges to protect fragile profits, and capital to buy paper that eats money in bales. They invent logos before logos are a thing. Keep ledgers that mature into double-entry bookkeeping, and learn quickly that nothing sells like a book people need. Yes, Bibles anchor the trade, but law, handbooks, medical regimens, grammars, sermons, songbooks, and maps pay the rent. In fairs like Frankfurt, stalls become an information bazaar. Contracts for reprints, gossip about new titles, advance sheets rustling like rumors. Censors learn the new dance too. Old guardians, bishops, princes, city councils try familiar. Levers, they license presses, publish indexes, seize seditious sheets. Sometimes they trim the wilder branches. Sometimes they simply prune yesterday's heresy, while tomorrow's pamphlets sprout in a different alley. The press does not create conflict. It accelerates it by lowering the cost of joining an argument. You can deplore a pamphlet war and still admit what it proves. Reading populations no longer wait for someone else to think for them. And oh, the pamphlets. If the medieval manuscript was a cathedral, the pamphlet is a market stall, quick to build, easy to move, ready to shout. Political broadsides, devotional leaflets, woodcut news sheets about comets and kings, how-to instructions for mending a broken axle or a broken heartall push out into streets and cross borders, folded under a coat. In an age that watched memory blow away like ash, this cheap redundancy becomes a safety net. If a city burns, the idea survives because 10 other towns own copies. Science gets levers it never had. Diagrams no longer travel as clumsy descriptions draw a circle, then another. They travel as themselves. A printer can set a copper plate of an anatomical dissection or a lunar crater and make identical images by the 100. A scholar in Basel can repeat a procedure in Padua because the drawing he sees is the drawing the author saw. Tables of numbers, of stars, barometric readings, pulse counts can be printed in grids so patterns show themselves like fish rising to a fly. Replication moves from sermon to system. Maps learn to be reliable strangers. Before print, every chart was the child of its maker's hand. After print, the same longitude can be pointed to by sailors who never met. A cartographer engraves a coast. A navigator notes a shoal in the margin. The second edition prints the correction. A third edition, stitched together with other men's corrections, guides a ship to a land. The ancient geographers never guessed, and a child will one day call home. Print lets geography behave like a conversation instead of a rumor. The revolution reaches workshops. Recipes that once lived in jealous guilds spilled not as betrayals, but as manuals. A dyer in Bruges prints a page on madder. A dyer in Bologna writes in the margin that hard water sulks unless you add bran. The next printing incorporates the fix. Standardization creeps in measures, terms, proportions, so that a handful becomes 4 ounces, and hot enough becomes a temperature someone else can actually achieve. When loss returns, and loss always visits skills that once died with a master, now hide in print waiting to be found again. Even time feels the press. Calendars become commodities. Towns coordinate festivals, tax days, court sessions with pages that agree down to the week. Post grows predictable because schedules can be printed and read by carriers who swap saddles on marked routes. Out of timetables and posted notices, news learns to wear a date. A story is no longer just what I heard in the square. It is what was printed on Tuesday, and Tuesday is a thing many strangers can share. Does the press end forgetting? No tool earns that boast, but it changes how forgetting happens. Knowledge no longer pools in single places where a fire, a siege, or a plague can drink it dry. It spreads redundant, imperfect, alive. If one city's memory drowns, another city's shelves drip dry and loan what's needed to rebuild. The network first of monasteries, then universities, now presses and fairs and postal riders becomes the archive, where the early medieval world kept wisdom like treasure in a locked chest. The print world keeps it like seed, little packets in 1,000 pockets, some of which survive any winter. Follow that seed across water. Within a century, presses thump in Seville for fleets and Mexico City for missionaries and merchants. Then, farther north, small wooden frames arrive in towns that will one day be called Cambridge and Boston and Philadelphia. The first American printers do what their cousins across the ocean did: prayers, laws, almanacs, maps, manuals. When knowledge lands on a new coast, print is the toolkit that lets it take root before wind or want can shake it loose. Meanwhile, back in Europe, a new kind of room appears: the coffee house and the bookshop backroom, where journals arrive regularly and strangers practice being a public by reading the same thing. The Republic of Letters, citizens of no single country, loyal to argument and address, emerges from nothing fancier than schedules and stamps, from printed periodicals that assume last month's issue is known and next month's will. Come, a network of people who don't agree on everything agree on methods. Cite, reply, retract, proceed. From the first pull of the platen, there were shadow costs. Errors multiplied faster too. Lies found wider fields. A bad diagram, beautifully printed, could mislead a generation. Censorship sometimes hid behind quality control, and monopolies on privileges sometimes starved honest competitors. But the press came with countermeasures packed inside it: debate, second editions, rival houses, reviews, and the reader's growing habit of asking, "Where did you get that?" The cure for bad print, people learned, was often more print better made, better argued, better -sourced. If you listen beneath the thud of the press, you will hear older sounds still carried forward and made sturdier. The monk's patience is there in the compositor who resets a stubborn line for the fourth time. The university's method is there in the printer's habit of listing sources and in the scholar's footnote. Like a small ladder for anyone who wants to climb, the translators. Courtesy lives in every glossary and every preface that opens a difficult book with a friendly paragraph. The story we've walked loss, salvage, bridge, rebuild did not end at a press. It found its multiplying organ. Step back and take in the sweep we've traveled, because this is where our road gently stops for the night. We stood in 476 inside faded marble and watched an empire's filing, cabinets spill. We walked through libraries burning and monks copying by candle, through languages splitting and being sewn back with glosses, through Toledo where 3 alphabets pulled wisdom through a narrow door, through plague that taught mercy to count and fear to write, through Byzantium's last gate where Greek manuscripts flew like embers that turned out to be seeds, through studios and studies where perspective, proof, and procedure learned each other's steps. And now, in this press room, we hear why the lights did not go out again the same way. We learn to keep knowledge not as hoard, not as halo, but as habit redundant, referenced, reachable. What did the printing press save? Not marble, not majesty, procedures, again. It taught us that ideas deserve addresses, page, line, figure, that corrections deserve sunlight, that cheap copies are not disrespect but dignity for readers who can't afford rare things. It made humility a feature. A page that says errata is a page that believes tomorrow is an ally, not a judge. Blow the lamp almost out. Let the fan carry the last ink scent into ordinary air. Somewhere in Venice, Oldys ties up another bundle of octavos. In Basel, a proofreader marks a comma that will save an argument. In Seville, a map with a newly corrected coast hangs to dry. In a Boston that is not Boston yet, a carpenter looks at a crate stenciled with a printer's mark and wonders whether his daughter might learn her letters on something new. The long night did not end with a trumpet and noon. It ended with a pull, press, dry, copy, compare, correct, reprint. It ended with rooms where people argued on paper and then handed the paper to strangers, trusting method more than charisma. It ended with many hands learning to share the work of remembering, so no single hand had to be perfect or immortal. Rest now. The story's flame is banked, not spent. If you liked this journey, if the soft fan and the old paper and the stubborn, hopeful people kept you company, leave me a sign in the morning. Tell me where you started listening and what part flickered for you. For now, close your eyes and feel the room steady around you. Knowledge is on the shelf and in your hands. It will be there when you wake.